If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
For those who camp, hike, hunt, and live in the woods or rural forests, what has been your creepiest encounter with something out of this world?
When I was 13, I went to a summer camp in northern Scotland. When we were there, I absolutely loved it. It was amazing. On the 14th night I was there, however, I started to notice that something kept moving past the window during the night. The few previous nights, I had noticed it but just kind of brushed it off as it was always around 2 a.m. and I was tired. This night was different. I was sitting on my phone for about 4 hours just watching videos when I saw the thing move past the window again. Initially, like always, I just brushed it off and left it when I realized that the shape moving past the window had actually stopped in the window as if it had seen me or something. I had no idea what to even rationalize it with. I was just frozen with fear. My best friend at the time, Logan, was in the bunk underneath me, and my older brother, John, was in the bunk across from me, so I woke them and told them the story of this weird figure. Halfway through telling it, I looked at the window again and could distinctly see two eyes staring at Logan. I kept my cool and said quietly to Logan and John, "Don't look now, but that thing I'm telling you about is now staring at you, Logan." Logan instantly jumped and turned to look at the window when we saw it had moved closer to the window. We all screamed and jumped back into bed when we saw John get up to try and go outside and see what this thing was. Logan was adamant that this thing was some sort of unholy creature sent by the devil. He was a diehard Christian, and I just didn't want to go outside. After the figure remained stationary for another 15 minutes, we all decided to just go outside and confront this thing. We slowly edged our way out the door and around the side of the building, where the window was, when we started to hear what sounded like human breathing. Me and Logan looked for a large stone and stick, respectively, so we could protect ourselves. All three of us jumped around the corner at the same time to confront this creature, and when we saw it, we all ran away. It left behind a horrible smell and what looked like a large piece of skin. I was homeless for a couple years and parked to sleep at a campsite up north of where I am. I pulled in, parked, fed the cats, and started to cook and relax. Flashlights appeared in my face, 4 of them all looking in the windows, so I assumed it was rangers asking me to move since the campsite was technically closed. I rolled down my window a bit and asked what was up, and apparently it was a family of 4 also parked and camping. They had a fire going and a dog, so I figured things were okay here, but there was a really weird feeling. My boyfriend at the time decided to try to befriend them, and we got out to chat. They asked a lot of very pointed personal questions. "Are you married? Do you live around here? Do you have any kids?" But actually, it was their 2 kids asking all the questions. They spoke like adults, which made me assume maybe trauma was a real part of their lives. At some point the kids put themselves to bed, by basically going, "Mom, Dad, we're headed to bed." That really rubbed me the wrong way. But whatever. It all got worse from here, though. They talked about the converted truck they live in. Apparently, the kids shared a bed, and a key point they made was that the van was soundproof. They really wanted to play with our cats, but no such luck. The husband and wife, I only remember the dude saying his name was Scooter, which, really? Also, the daughters' names were Olivia and Steven, obviously fake names. They started to try and separate me and my boyfriend, saying things like, "Let's walk to the river and let's go look at the car." They were really interested in hearing about any injuries we had, and at some point they started letting the fire go out and standing behind us a lot. That was enough. We left some stuff behind and got in the car, started it up, and just talked like, "WTF?" It took 2 minutes for the woman to walk up to the van and ask if we were leaving. We said no, obviously, and that we were just cold. She asked to sit in the seat behind us. I asked why. She didn't answer and asked if she could sit with us or on my lap, and again, I asked why. She again didn't answer. She said we can't leave her there because her husband beats her, and so I asked if she wanted the police. She didn't answer, pulled out a cigarette, and lit up, leaning against the door of our car. We looked at each other, and I heard someone douse the fire. I said baby. Just out of so much nervousness, which is when I found out my boyfriend was suspicious from the beginning and didn't think to say anything until now, only to add that if I had stayed and not followed him to the car, he would have just left me there. He was a waste of space, but before I could process it, I heard the husband grab something off of the fire tool set. One thing I noticed, and there was a large red axe, and I just got tunnel vision and hit the gas. I felt the bitch pounce off the side of my van as we pulled away, and just as we got on the road, an ambulance was behind us with its lights flashing. I wasn't stopping for it. You know how easy it is to buy emergency lights for any car on Amazon? No duckin', thanks. The ambulance turned off to a dead-end road eventually after a while of demons driving into town. We never heard a siren. We looked it up, and the aforementioned river was 2.5 miles into the dense woods. Apparently, a lot of people go missing out there. I wonder who's to blame. So, ever since I was young, I have been going outdoors and exploring alone. As an adult, I travel around, hike, and backpack in some pretty remote areas all over the country. Many times miles from civilization. I never felt afraid at all, not one bit, except for one time 2 years ago. I was traveling from Colorado to California and decided to take the loneliest road in America, Highway 50, across Nevada. To get a sense of how remote it can be, at one point I saw a sign that said 128 miles to the next gas station. About 40-ish miles west of Ely, Nevada, I went off of that road onto a side gravel road and drove like 20 minutes down that. I decided to camp there for the night. I was surrounded by mountains, but not directly. Basically, it was vast and flat all around me in every direction for hundreds of yards before eventually hitting the mountains. So I could see for a long time in every direction. There was no sneaking up on me. During the day, everything was completely fine, birds were chirping, I was walking around exploring, etc. No issues. Then it got dark. It was about 10 p.m. when it happened. The sound just disappeared. Immediately, when it happened, all my hair stood up, and I had goosebumps all over my body. I started almost having what was like an anxiety attack and kept tapping my ears, wondering why there was no sound. I was camping in my car, and I looked around quickly and didn't see anything at all. Keep in mind that if someone was coming, I would be able to see them from well over a mile away. I don't know if my mind was playing tricks on me, but way off in the distance, I saw what I can only describe as a floating light. It was too far away to really see anything, but it was there. At first, I thought it was maybe a hiker or camper, but then I realized that in order for that to be true, they would have had to pass me to get to where they are now, so no way is it a person. During this, there was still no sound, and when I saw the light, I just felt pure fear. Not to sound cocky, but I'm a big, strong, athletic guy, so not much scares me, and I kept telling myself I was crazy and nothing was wrong, but I couldn't shake it. It was like pure primal fear. At one point, I was shaking, and I was so afraid that I climbed in the back of my car and sat in the back seat. I have limo-tinted windows in the back. I wanted so badly to look out the window, but I was so afraid my body wouldn't let me. The noise was messing with my mind and body. Technically, I could have started my car and left, but I was so afraid and civilization was so far away that I just sat there in the back seat, shaking. At one point, I just had this feeling that something was right outside my car looking at me, but I was too afraid to look. I didn't have any service on my phone either. The last thing I remember is me just sitting there in my back seat, terrified, and the next thing I knew, I saw the sun coming up, sound had returned, and I heard birds chirping. That fear that washed over me was gone, and I felt perfectly fine. I didn't even leave immediately. I got up, cooked breakfast, and hung out before leaving. I've told this story on the internet a few times, and most people always say that it was aliens or skinwalkers. Especially when I tell them about the floating light orb. I, however, don't believe in stuff like that. I'm one of those people who believes there is a logical explanation for everything. But I cannot explain what happened that night. The absolute fear I felt all over my body. It was like I was a rabbit about to get eaten by wolves. I've never been so terrified in my life. I have continued to hike and backpack with no fear or issues ever since. This wasn't really camping, but I have an intriguing story about it. So me and my friends went stargazing at a mountain not far from my village. The village was so close that we could see the lights shining in the distance. The mountain is accessible by road, but it's a dirt road and not very wide. In some places, 2 cars cannot pass next to each other. So we arrive there, and the sun barely lights the sky up. I took the opportunity to turn the car back to face where we came from, so it wouldn't be a struggle later on. We sat there and talked about everything while we were looking at the stars. It started to get cold, so we went to sit back in the car. The moon is out and lighting up the road, but not that much. Suddenly, I get this feeling that something isn't right, like something is about to happen. I asked my friends, and they felt the same. Then, I look in the rear view mirror, and from a distance, I see a shadowy figure speeding towards the car. One of my friends had those military flashlights, so he pointed them towards them. It didn't look like a human, for sure. In a split second, I start up the car and race out of there. At that time, I had an old car, and you shouldn't go faster than 20 to 30 kilometers per hour due to the poor road quality. But I was here doing 50 to 70 kilometers per hour. There was a chance the car might flip, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away as fast as possible. When we eventually made it home, I saw the left tire on the back was flat. I didn't mind, knowing we were safe. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't taken the time to turn the car when we arrived on the mountain. This happened to my roommate and me 2 years ago, when we drove into the national forest just outside of the town we live in. We go to a small college in New England, about 3 hours from any major city. For context, this forest has quite a few urban legends surrounding it, and the local community, although they do go there often, has a lot of superstitions about how to be safe while there. I had just broken up with my partner, and my roommate could sense I was feeling down. Finals were just around the corner, so she decided to help me get my mind off things and suggested we go to a nice spot she had found last week to just chill and de-stress. We took a couple of beers with us and drove to this secluded spot in the forest. From the moment we left the main asphalt road in the forest, I saw a couple of things that unsettled me. You could see the abandoned houses of a ghost town from the higher ground the road was on, and we saw this old doll hanging from a rope on a tree. Creepy SHT, but we didn't really give it a second thought and kept driving. We got to a clearing and parked our car behind some trees, popped open the back of our SUV, and started just talking and playing music. About 10 minutes into this, 2 cars appeared from the road and parked in the clearing. My friend didn't pay them attention. Instead, she kept talking, but as I was facing them from where I sat, I couldn't stop seeing what they did. A guy popped out of each car, talked for a few minutes, and then I saw them take out a long object covered in a dark plastic bag from the back of one of the cars. This is when I noticed these guys had guns, not like shotguns, which I see often in this town, but handguns. Then they started lighting the bag on fire. I told my friend to get down, and she turned around and saw them for the first time. Black smoke was rising from the bag, and between trying to keep my head down and steal glances at them, I saw them take out a second object and heard them shoot at it, right before they set it on fire. I don't know how long my friend and I were lying there in silence, but it was definitely enough to let the terror sink in and whisper to each other how much we loved each other, in case this was what we thought it was. At some point, I looked up and saw that they were pointing at our car. I saw them walking into the woods, maybe trying to follow our tracks or trying to look for us. All I know is that right then, I told my friend to jump into the driver's seat and make a run for it. I shut the back door, and between that and the car starting up, the guys heard it and started running towards us, then ran towards one of their cars and hopped in. We went over a hill, and as we drove way above what was safe for dirt roads on a hillside, we lost them. We drove to a neighboring town and roamed around for a while, just to make sure no one was following us, before we went back to our dorm. That day, we tried to make fun of the whole situation and got really drunk before finally breaking down and crying from knowing we had seen something we were not supposed to. We were at first terrified of telling anyone, but eventually did tell officers on campus who contacted the police, but never found anything. My partner and I were taking a walk in the PNW one summer morning. We were in what was called a nature park, not quite a reserve, but a suburban 200-acre natural area ranging over a hillside. It has about 3 miles of trails through grassland and pine forest. There's quite a bit of densely forested area with streams and no trails. The park is large enough to support deer and some small black bears. There are no dogs allowed, and there is absolutely no hunting. It's popular with birders. It was about 9:30 a.m. as we were heading up the hill toward the park entrance. We heard a barred owl hoot. It was the "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" call. We immediately heard a response call of the same notes, except it was not quite right. We heard the owl hoot again, and that one was totally normal. Next, we heard the uncanny one. It sounded like an imitation that was good, but it was just enough to make me realize that it probably wasn't an actual owl. Then came the owl's perfect hoot again. This was repeated maybe 5 times, and each time the uncanny one was less convincing. Next, we heard one of the weirdest sounds I've ever heard in nature. It was a low, deep, pitiful moan. We looked around, and there were a few other people around, but nobody paid any attention to the strangeness unfolding in the forest. This whole thing probably took less than 3 minutes. When we got home, we explained what we heard to our teenagers. The kids and I each looked through animal sound libraries. We had no luck until one kid came to me with a recording and asked if it was what we heard. It was. It was a recording of a young black bear moaning after being frightened and reaching safety. Apparently, it's not common and fairly distinctive. Black bears can frighten easily, though. My question was, and still is, who or what was mimicking an owl, and is that what scared the black bear so badly it fled and moaned? A few of my friends and I went on a hike we'd never been on before, quite a few years ago. One friend wanted to cut through the houses to go back, however, I had said we needed to go back the same way because this trail isn't a loop. So we go through the houses. In summary, we found ourselves completely lost. We asked someone we walked by if they knew how to get back to the parking lot, but they didn't know. We made it on the highway. We nearly got run over several times and found some sort of trail that we went on because it was better than being on the busy highway. As we were walking, none of us had a signal, we had one drop of water left. We'd been lost for about 4 hours at that stage, and we were getting very worried. We thought there must be people on the trail, and they must know something about how to get to the parking lot of that specific trail we were on since it was quite popular. We came across a man who wasn't able to help. About 2 minutes later, a woman appeared who seemed to have kind of heard us, kind of not. She had a large sun hat and was very tall. I recalled that she wore very clean beach sandals, but one of my friends remembers her being barefoot. She told us to follow her, and she told us she teaches women how to forage, and she was touching some of the plants we were walking past. We have followed her for about 5 to 10 minutes when she disappears completely after turning a corner. So we were all like, okay, we have to keep going this way since it's just one trail. Eventually, we get to a fork in the trail, and there is a literal arrow on the ground made out of sticks and flowers that points to one of the trails in the fork. And we thought, what are the odds that this was her? There's no way she had time to make this beautiful arrow that's tied to a vine and has flowers coming out of it. But we decided to go that way anyway. About 10 to 15 minutes later, we reached the car. I never saw that woman again, but she absolutely saved us. We could not believe what happened and still talk about it every now and then to this day. She was definitely a mountain goddess. My dad and I always went deer hunting near Thomas Mount, off Highway 20 in Nee, Washington State. One of my favorite hunting spots was a low logging road that followed a stream back into the woods, about 2 miles to a very secluded meadow. One evening, when it was time to stop for the day, I decided to hike straight through the woods to another access road that I knew was about half mile above me rather than do the full 2 miles back to the truck. About halfway out, I stumbled upon a very large, very dense cluster of dead trees that I had to hike through to reach my pickup point. I got to about the middle of the grove with my eyes mostly closed while getting poked in the face by branches, so I decided to duck down to try to find the best way out. That was when I noticed that not only were the trees bare on their lower 3 feet or so, but they were also covered in dark black moss and lichen, and there were old bones all over the ground. The bones were disarticulated and covered in various mosses and dirt, but there were a lot of them. As soon as I saw that, I realized I was stuck in the middle of a creepy death zone in the woods, with the sun rapidly setting in about 1/4 mile before the safety of the truck, and I got super creeped out. I put my gun on my back, my arms up in front of me, and smashed my way through the trees as quickly as possible. There are lots of cougars in the area, and I assumed the bones were from their hunting activity, but it was still one of the scariest events I've ever had in nature. I don't believe in supernatural or paranormal stuff, but stuck in those trees with the dark closing in, I got some super bad vibes, and I've never been back there since. Side note, a few years before, and further up that same logging road, I had a very close encounter with a mother bear and her 3 cubs. They came down a side trail almost right up to me while I was sitting, hidden, under a tree. The mom got within about 10 feet of me before she realized what I was and ran off into the woods, leaving me lone with the cubs, who quickly followed. That was unnerving in a different way, but comparing the two events, I would take the bears any day. I was camping with some high school friends back in the 80s. We were about 6 miles down a newly built dirt logging road in some deep, truly frightening. Sadly, the tape was lost long ago. Not too long after that, we started hearing stories of people encountering Bigfoot on the local section of the Appalachian Trail. I have no idea if that was Bigfoot we heard, and I'm very skeptical about anything like that, but I'm sure it was no bear we heard. I went camping with my wife and stepdaughter the other night near Laguna Mountain in California. We were off the main road on a secluded route that seldom had cars passing by. There was no foot traffic through the area at all. We heard a noise late during the night that honestly could be explained logically by something natural we don't know about. However, my wife and I have both been losing sanity trying to understand what that noise could have been or what could have made the noise. The first occurrence of the noise occurred around midnight, and we can only describe it as a slow, deliberate, rhythmic nail scratching on the tension paracord strips that were securing the tent to the ground. Naturally, we thought it might have been a critter curious about the tent, but the slowness and rhythm of the noise make us believe otherwise, because critters like that generally scratch quickly and sound more hasty. The other conclusion that leads us to believe it wasn't a critter is because, throughout the night, we actually did hear squirrels running around outside, curious about all our stuff that was outside. Why is that detail important? Because during the time leading up to the noise and the time after the noise, we heard absolutely no critters outside running up to or away from the tent. Whatever was creating the noise was absolutely silent coming up to and away from the tent, Or, eerily enough, may have been floating or something of that nature. We did hear it again around 2 a.m. the same night, and during that specific episode, the noise seemed to have shifted from one corner of the tent to the corner closer to our heads, allowing us to even feel the vibration of the scratching reverberating throughout the floor of the tent. That's what leads me to believe it was the taut paracord strips because of the tension, allowing the vibration to be much stronger. We may have heard the noise again a third time, but it seemed so weak and went on for such a short duration compared to the other times that we honestly couldn't really key in on the noise that time, so we aren't sure if that was actually the same thing or just our sanity playing tricks on us. My wife and I were very disturbed when we heard that, and it honestly kept us awake and on high alert for a while. We are very curious to know what it may have been. Has anyone had a similar experience? I lived in the same small neighborhood and house throughout my entire childhood. I guess you could say I knew the neighborhood pretty well. I grew up in a rural part of Oregon where it's heavily forested in all directions. Well, one day I'm riding my dirt bike around my neighborhood. My neighbors didn't mind me riding on the streets as long as I wasn't reckless, and I decided to go up a driveway that led to a piece of abandoned, unowned property that was perfect for riding my dirt bike on. I had been there many times before, and I loved it because it was out of the neighborhood, so I didn't have to worry about being safe. But this particular time, as soon as I got to the first open spot, I noticed it was littered with trash. I'll admit, I rummaged through the garbage, but I did find some pretty neat things that clearly nobody else wanted. As I was looking through the papers that were left behind to look for a name to potentially give to the police, I had an eerie feeling come over me like I was being watched from behind. I turned around and saw nothing. I was still really uncomfortable and constantly felt like I was being watched. I was getting ready to leave and take everything I had found back home. As I was walking to my bike, because I had parked it about 20 feet away, I had a serious urge to look over my right shoulder. I did so, and once I turned, I saw something slip behind a tree. It was looking at me and tried hiding from me when it saw that I looked in its direction. I sat there for a few more seconds when I watched massive hands and paws grab the sides of the tree. This tree was probably about the size of a power pole, and the hands wrapped almost all the way around it, so it had some good-sized hands. As soon as I saw those hands grab that tree, I was frozen solid. They were huge compared to the tree. And that's when I saw it, a 5-tall, hairy figure poked its head out from behind the tree, looking me directly in the eyes. It didn't move towards me, and I sure as hell didn't move towards it. For a moment, we just kind of stood there and stared at each other. It seemed like it was about to SHT its pants out of fear just as much as I was. After a couple seconds of being frozen up, I finally worked up the courage to look away and start my bike. I never turned my head back to see what it did after I started my bike. I rode out of there as fast as possible and immediately went home. I walked in the front door, and my dad looked at me with a confused look. He says, "Are you good? You look like you just saw a ghost." It's been years since someone bought the piece of property. Their house is now within 20 feet of the tree where I ran into whatever that thing was. I'd like to think it was a little short of Bigfoot because that's what it looked like, except rather than being 8 feet tall, it was only 5 feet or so. I was backpacking last weekend in the Allegheny National Forest in northwest Pennsylvania with a friend of mine and his teenage son. We hiked the Minister Creek Trail and set up camp that night, about 4 miles away from the trailhead. We saw only 2 other parties that day, and neither were overnighting on the trail. We explored the area we camped in extensively to find the best campsite and did not see any other campers within at least a mile in either direction. The rest of the forest was heavy growth hillsides on either side of the valley without anywhere good to set up camp. About 2 a.m., I was woken up by the sound of drumming. It sounded like a single drum and had a rhythmic beat, like bum 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 bum. If anyone is familiar with the Cleveland Indians baseball team, now the Guardians, they used to have a guy who would beat on a native-style drum, and it sounded exactly like that. It was loud and close sounding, and it reverberated throughout the valley we were camped in. If I were to guess, I would say it sounded as if it were within 100 yards of our location. I got up out of my tent to investigate, and my friend had also been woken up by the sound. We couldn't see anything other than the dark woods around us. This continued for at least 2 hours until I was able to fall back to sleep. The next morning, we woke up, all was normal. We continued on our hike and did not see any other campers around. I have no clue what it was. I have watched videos of grouse drumming, and that definitely wasn't it. Obviously it could have been a person, and likely it was, but sitting out in the middle of the woods at night drumming on a drum for at least 2 hours straight without skipping a beat? Perhaps there is some Native American ritual that calls for this? I guess this story isn't too creepy, but I've been obsessing over the answer to this since Sunday morning. So I shoot archery, and target shooting gets so damn boring. So I would take a stroll through the woods, shooting trees. One time, though it was probably early fall, around 4 p.m. on a Saturday, I heard some footsteps ahead of me. So I hid behind a tree. I was a sophomore at the time, so I'm 160 pounds and 6 feet with a bow and arrow. The last thing I need is for the cops to come after me. So I stop and wait, and it's a soccer mom and her family on a walk through the woods. So I chill out behind a tree, waiting for them to bug off so I can go home, but the kids decide to stop and play. It had probably been 10 minutes before I said, "Duck it," stash my bow and arrow under some leaves, and head home. I come. Act at night, probably at 9:30 p.m. I walk along the street until I reach a point in the woods. I had stashed my gear. I had a flashlight on hand and quickly found it. Now I couldn't walk along the street to get home with my bow and arrow. It was probably a half mile and a 1/3 mile walk through the woods. The flashlight had a hook and magnet on it, so I strapped my quiver on and put the flashlight on my bow. I started making my way home. I noticed some deer ahead of me, and I let them be because I knew how nasty bucks could be. They were acting funny, but they weren't running. When I got closer, they would walk 20 or 30 feet ahead of me and wait for me to get just within range to see their bodies. I never saw them, just their green, reflective eyes. But by the looks of how many eyes there were at least 15. As I started slowly walking home, I kept hearing noises behind me, leaves crunching and twigs breaking. I was on high alert. I wouldn't have cared if the sounds weren't getting closer. I would glance over my shoulder, not seeing anything. It got to the point where I was walking with my bow drawn and an arrow ready. When the sounds were within 10 feet behind me, I would spin around, ready to shoot each time, just missing whatever was disapparating out of my range of light. There was always a blur in my peripheral vision. I was panicking on the inside but stayed physically calm and continued slowly walking home, keeping an eye on the deer in front of me and an ear on the noises behind me. The thing behind me was making more noise than over a dozen deer in front of me. As soon as I saw my house light, a glimmer of hope flashed through me. I heard thumping behind me before I could turn. At least 10 deer blitz past me. That pushes me over the edge, and I bolt for home. I cover 200 yards in a few seconds. I took a deep breath, relaxing. My fingers were bruised and cut from holding my string so long. I put the arrow away and glanced at the woods, and I swear to you, I saw a set of red eyes 7 or 8 feet off the ground. It was looking from behind a tree, which I knew was its size, so I knew how tall it was. I couldn't make out its body. It looked vaguely human, but it was darker than the surrounding area. Once inside, I learned I was missing 3 arrows. I had all of them when I picked them up, and my arrows are 32 inches long and my quiver 29 inches tall. None could fall out. Something took them out as I walked through the woods only during the day. In the next few weeks, I found the arrows embedded in trees. When I shoot them, they'll go half an inch. This thing pushed them at least a foot in. To this day, I don't know what it was, nor will I go into the woods at night unless it's an emergency. That night, though I felt hatred and malice in the air, this thing wanted to toy with me and hurt me. If I'm in the woods during the day, I just feel uneasy, but if I'm near the woods or look at them at night, I can still feel that anger and rage. This happened in a more rural area of South Jersey. Please let me know if anyone has had similar experiences or any insight. In May 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto and were still stuck living together after the breakup, as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting. So when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping or fishing trip, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful. Loads of lush forest, farmer fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands, and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field. I'm guessing it was trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the shit, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a really good night. We turned in just after midnight, and we shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably around 1:30. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping noise. I was kind of groggy, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant, and it sounded like a strange coyote. I laid there for a moment, listening, and then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried ignoring it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, It sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog. But what if this one was rabid, or something? What if they could smell our food? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I'm prone to worrying about these types of things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise woke him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided he'd shine the flashlight on it and holler a lot, hopefully scaring him off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him point the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and babbled, "It's not a coyote, it's a dude, it's some weird dude." Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and scare easily. I won't even watch horror movies, but I've never seen someone look that scared. And I never want to see that expression on someone's face again. So I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling type noises were still going on, and in retrospect, it really didn't sound like a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. Anyway, he kept telling me to just look out the tent flap to make sure he's not crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing. I felt like shit, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust, and that was when I saw him. He was standing only a few arm lengths away from the tent. He was swaying slightly, wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful, though, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy, if the making of high-pitched noises at a stranger's tent in the middle of the night didn't give it away. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy to duck off. My buddy started yelling, "Excuse me, can you duck off? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped, it was dead silent, and that was when we heard footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside the tent, but we didn't waste any time, we started yelling again. "Seriously, duck off. We have cell phones in here. If you don't duck off, we're going to call the cops." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off. It sounded like he was moving towards the road. Needless to say, we lay awake, petrified, until the first sign of sunlight, and then we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home and were both pretty embarrassed about how scared we got. It definitely was not manly on either of our parts. I think because we were both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much, we really haven't ever talked about it since that day. So there you go. There's my weird story. I'll always wonder what the hell that guy was doing out there, or what was wrong with him. Sometimes I wonder if things would have turned out differently if we were a couple of girls. I'm not saying he was some serial killer, but it seemed like he was testing who was in the tent. I guess I'll never know. And for that, I'm kind of glad. About a year and a half ago, my mom told me a story about how, when she was at a park with her cousins when she was a kid, they came across a strange monument in a more secluded area of the park, where there were two pillars. Mom said she had recently watched a movie about demons, possession, hell, etc., so when she saw this monument, she got super freaked out. The weird thing is, though, that all the other kids were freaked out too, even though they had no logical reason to be scared. So they started to leave the park. As they left, they got more and more freaked out, until eventually all of them were sprinting as fast as they could to get out of the park. When they got to the entrance, they all froze. My mom told me that she heard someone say her name, but it was like it came from inside her own head, like it was a thought she had, only it wasn't hers. She didn't say anything about it until one of the other kids piped up and asked if any of the other kids had heard their name as well. They never spoke of it again after that. Until, of course, my mom told me. She's very adamant about not talking about it ever again, and she even says she made a mistake telling me. That brings us to my part of all this. I live in a fairly urban area, but there is a park nearby with a huge wooded area that I've gone to a lot, just to hang out. There are lots of trails in those woods. There was also a strange-looking rock formation in these woods that I felt weirdly drawn to. Over time, as I went there more and more, I started to become paranoid, to the point where I was constantly looking over my shoulder for someone watching me. Eventually, while leaving the park one night, I saw a sort of yellowish figure out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look at it, it ran back into the woods faster than anything I'd seen before. It looked almost like a blur. Later that night, I was lying in bed, talking to my friends, and I was getting tired, so I decided to go to bed. I said goodbye and hung up, and that's the last coherent memory I remember having that night. All I can recall beyond that is laying in bed, so tired that I feel like I can't move, staring at the ceiling, and feeling someone's presence in the room with me. I didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary, but I remember being terrified and not having the energy to move. Eventually, I fell asleep for the rest of the night and woke up the next morning completely fine. I never went back to those woods again. I'm well aware that this sounds like the plot of a horror movie, but this is something that still messes me up to this day to even think about. I lived on a big family farm. Before a dispute amongst distant cousins, I could ride my bike to the furthest point, with a road, and still encounter family. One end was my house, the other was my great-grandmother's house, and between us was one big incline that led up and to the rest of the hundreds of acres. That was to the left. On the right side was a field with a dried creek and trees growing and dying along where they once had water. This was the bottom of the property, split by a small dirt road and sandwiched by a main road. In the fall, I could see the main road going past the field and through the trees. This was late spring, early summer. I went past my grandma's house to enjoy a cool ride on the overly shaded path. The overgrown field, sometimes full of flowers on my right, made it all the better. As soon as I left the hot sun and the canopy blanketed me, the temperature changed drastically. I was expecting to be cool and shady, not bitter, and to see my breath. I had this horrible weight on my gut, and I was overwhelmed with fear. My fight or flight was screaming at me to get away from there and to not look right. My fear was overwhelming, and I couldn't help but turn my head as I realized I could hear the dry grass crunching along with the crunching of gravel. The tall grass was bending in a way that was indicative of someone running through it. The grass was between 4 and 5 feet high. The possibilities are endless for what it could be. As I swung my head back to make sure I wasn't going to crash as I increased speed, I realized there was a second trail in the grass. I nearly stomped on my brakes to observe, still panicking. I wondered if maybe I wasn't the prey in mind. As I came to a halt, I slid a bit in the gravel, an animal screamed, and I noticed the muzzle of a deer, or what looked like it at a glance, break the top of the grass. As a clear scuffle broke out, the grass moving appropriately, I sped off again, not wanting whatever predator to choose me for dessert. I hid at my great-grandma's in one of her outbuildings. Someone had to get me because I was so scared. They didn't understand and just gave me a hard time for taking their time. It took me 4 years to ride my bike back through there, and I only did it once more out of necessity. The overwhelming fear and dread I felt were gone as soon as I was past there, out of the canopy, and in the next clearing in the sun. I couldn't hear any of the noises when I got past, even though I was only maybe another 100 years down. It's hard for me not to think it's supernatural in some way because less than 300 feet away from where the prey was taken is a cemetery for children. A very small plot, in fact, only 4 are buried there. I've also always been told my whole life that the animals I could have possibly seen are more visible after dusk. To see them just after 1 p.m. is fairly odd. I don't have any reason to return, but I still shudder and shake at the idea of being alone on that small stretch of dirt road again. The dread I felt that day was suffocating. I was just looking to see if anyone else has experienced anything similar, or if people could possibly have any explanations. The other night, me and a couple friends were camping, and at around 4 in the morning, with me being restless, I was awake, and on the side of the tent, I saw 2 dim lights. I thought nothing of it at the time, thinking it was my friend's phone that could have turned on in his sleep with it being so dim, so I tried going back to sleep. Later that morning, both of my friends talked about seeing those same lights at around the same time, and how no one had any idea what they were. I've thought about it, and to the best of my knowledge, there were no other campers or even campsites in the area, especially not in the directions that the lights were. The road was also in the opposite direction, and the woods were pretty forested. It was also cloudy, so I doubt it was moonlight. I don't know if it's important to the story, but in the stream about 100 feet away from the campsite the morning after, one of the friends found a pretty big piece of what I think was obsidian in the stream. I never left or looked outside the tent, so I have no idea what it could have been. I'm open to any ideas, and thanks for the help. To give some background, I grew up in scouting and left around the age of 15. I've recently become involved again as a leader, and I had forgotten about my experiences camping in rural Australia until revisiting a campsite and reminiscing on some scary stories. I figured I'd share it here and potentially gain some insight into what this may have been. I was about 13 or 14 at the time and had gone on a camping trip with my troop. We went to a campsite we stayed at often, as it was only around 30 minutes away from our city. It was large and open to many scouts, as it acted as a hub for the combined activities that all groups would attend, but this particular camp was only for our group, which consisted of 10 to 12 people. We set up camp in a back corner of the campsite, which was backed by a fence and thick trees, leading to a cliff overlooking a river if you walked far enough. We arrived around 6 p.m., set up camp, and basically went straight to bed. It's fairly consistent in my area that asking 11-15-year-olds to set up camp takes far longer than it should, and we were pretty tired. In the center of the campsite was a large toilet block surrounded by rocks and separated into 4 sections, male and female, adult and youth. Our campsite was probably about 300 meters from this block. The first 2 nights went without incident, but it was our 3rd night that something occurred that left myself and 2 others with a sleepless night and an apprehension about camping there again. It was 3 to a tent, and we all hopped into our sleeping bags for our last night before heading home. The others in the tent, we'll call them Olivia and Jess for privacy reasons, dozed off fairly quickly, but it took me a little longer. I've always struggled to fall asleep and stay asleep, so when I seemingly randomly woke not long after nodding off, it wasn't a huge shock. Nothing seemed amiss at first, so I closed my eyes to try to fall asleep once again. It only took a few seconds for me to hear footsteps walking towards the toilet block. We were camped on an area of lush green grass that scrunched under your feet, and the sound of someone walking was distinct in the quiet night. I thought it was strange. I hadn't heard of a tent zipper, but I brushed it off. A few minutes later, I heard them approaching, still a normal course of events. Until the footsteps stopped outside our tent, I looked over, and both Olivia and Jess were sound asleep, so I knew it wasn't one of them. I waited a few seconds, and they continued moving, so again, I figured it was strange but brushed it off. It then sounded as though the footsteps looped around the group of tents and back to ours, on the other side this time. The tents were set up in a line with a fair amount of distance between them to account for guy ropes as wind had been forecast, but on this night the wind was almost non-existent. The person, or thing, had seemed to walk around the whole line to stop back at ours again, which was second closest to the toilet block in a line of 4. I then heard them walk toward the tree line. I sat up, trying to listen as closely as I could. At this point, I was sure it wasn't one of us. The behavior of the footsteps was too strange, and why on earth had they sounded like they were walking into the trees? I think it was close to 2 a.m. at this point, and I had had enough of being alone to experience this. I gently shook Olivia awake, shushing her as she stirred. Olivia was my closest friend in the group, and I whispered a quick explanation of what I heard to her. We agreed to wait a while and see if anything else happened. Quite a few minutes passed, I don't remember how many, and the weirdness of the situation had started to wear off, and I was about to suggest trying to fall back asleep when the footsteps seemed to return from where they had left and again stop behind our tent. Olivia and I shared a look at the dim light the moon was casting in the tent, and I could tell she was as unsettled as I was. We heard them begin to slowly circle the tent, and she silently moved to the huddle next to me. Bit by bit, the footsteps began to quicken until they seemed to break into a run. Whoever or whatever it was had to expertly dodge our guys' ropes to move at that speed without tripping. Every now and then something would brush the sides of the tent while Olivia and I were holding each other, doing our best not to make a noise. It was at this point that Jess woke up and groggily asked, "What the hell is going on?" She looked over to us, tears forming in our eyes, and shot up, terror crossing her face. She silently moved over to us to join us in our terror-filled huddle. Her question did not seem to faze whatever was making the noise. The sprinting went on for what felt like ages, but in reality, it was probably only a minute or so until they stopped in front of our tent again. I slowly reached for a spare tent peg and gripped it as tight as I could, thinking that, in a pinch, it would do as some kind of weapon. The footsteps slowly wrapped around the tents again, stopping behind ours and then retreating back to the tree line. With some insane burst of courage and morbid curiosity, I decided to try and look around outside. Still gripping my tent peg, I slowly unzipped our tent, trying to be as soundless as possible. The fly unzipped from the bottom, so I laid down and peeked underneath, rather than unzip it and then potentially create more noise. The footsteps seemed to stop shortly after their retreat, and there were no further noises. This would mean that the person would have had to get over a wire fence without a sound, which didn't seem plausible, but I saw absolutely nothing. Needless to say, the 3 of us didn't get any more sleep that night. When recounting this story to our leaders that morning, we were told we had probably heard a possum or some other animal, an explanation I simply do not buy. None of the other campers had heard anything. Some of the strangest parts of this experience to me are that there were no other sounds other than the footsteps and the occasional brushing of the tent, no heavy breathing or any spoken words or even animal noises. The person or thing seemed to disappear when I went to look, and the targeted and odd nature of the behavior. Why was our tent targeted? Had something been looking for a target, and when I awoke, it chose us? Why did it just leave after scaring the ever-living daylights out of a group of teen girls? Why hadn't anyone else heard anything? Our tents were decently spaced apart for the guy ropes, so it is plausible that the noise was harder to hear for other campers and maybe not enough to wake them, but the sound seemed fairly loud to us. If anyone has ever had a similar experience or has any idea what could have happened, I would love to hear about it. This isn't the only experience I've had while camping, and not the only one at this campsite, but certainly the only one of this magnitude that I had at this particular spot. I know there are some creatures and lore attached to rural Australia, but I'm a little uneducated on them and would love to learn what this could have been. I had a weird experience last night on a solo trip that I thought would be funny to share. I've gone on a few solo trips this year, one trip with a buddy up in the Catskills, and done plenty of hiking in the middle of nowhere. I also have too much, experience sleeping in crappy conditions due to my time in the military. In terms of general solo camper fears, I'm not one to actually worry about predators, not much I can do besides take precautions and be prepared, the dark, or supernatural/urban legend type things. So, I decided to take an overnight trip to Stokes for the first time Friday night to test out some of my new cold weather gear and see if I could make it through the night with what I had. I also figured if it got too bad, I could always go to my car and crank the heat for a bit, so I wasn't too worried about that either. I've been dreaming of this trip for a couple months while I waited for some free time and cold weather to actually test everything out, plus I'd always wanted to see Stokes. Much to my surprise, the Steam Mill campground area, the most remote in the park, was completely open for the night. I was stoked, as I usually prefer dispersed or remote camping, but I have limited options in New Jersey to do so, and I saw this as a blessing. The wonderful lady at the check-in office joked with me about not needing to worry about noise ordinances since I was to be completely alone out there. She mentioned that perhaps some more hardy people like myself would decide to book last-minute trips and join me out there. I took the compliment and went on my way. It was in the 30s, female, by the time I got there, and I enjoyed my coffee, food, fire, and audiobook. I also enjoyed a cigar as there was nobody present, so I didn't risk offending anyone with the smell. As the sun set, the wind picked up to 25 miles per hour gusts, a high 20s temp, and a feels like temp of 21. It was certainly cold, and the gear was surprisingly efficient. However, at one point in the night, I decided to look outside of my tent to take in the view of the stars, which is my favorite part of any camping trip. The moon was especially bright, but that's when it hit me, I'm completely alone. Again, normally that would never bother me, in fact, it would usually leave me elated, but it nevertheless filled me with such a deep and profound sense of terror. It wasn't about predators, it wasn't about what might be out there. It was sheer dread and terror. This was a campground with about 20 or so sites, and nobody was there but me. I'm still wondering if it was that very thought that irked me so much, which I'm just realizing now. Is there a fear of being in empty places that shouldn't be empty or something? I don't know. All I know is that I moved my sleeping pad and bags into my car hoping to get a more secure feeling, but that didn't help, and in the windy darkness, I broke down my stuff faster than ever and booked it home, feeling completely on edge the entire ride home and honestly pretty damn ashamed. That was still such a primal sense of fear that I've only ever experienced once in my life, and perhaps I took the flight route, though I don't know how I could have fought nothingness. It was either sit there awake all night or go home, and I chose the latter. I just didn't understand why it got to that point. I had been in significantly more dangerous and sketchy situations before and never got to this point. That night was just a different type of fear. So this happened back in August of 2021. I was hanging out with my now ex-best friend, and we were around my house outside, just for some fresh air, since at the time, the inside of my home was very humid all day and night. It was getting late, around 11 p.m., but he wanted to do something scary and fun before he went home, which was to walk around my forest. For context, I live around a forest. I also used to joke around a lot, saying my forest was haunted at night, so we did. We used our phone's lights as flashlights, and our goal was to do one whole lap around the forest, which one path would lead all the way back to my home. It also took roughly 10 minutes per lap. Anyway, he dared me to walk in first, and so I did. I didn't want to be a pussycat that night after all, so I acted as casually as I could and made my way in first, as he followed right behind me. As we walked in, we would have to take a left to continue down the path after a few steps, so as I saw the end of the path to where we would turn, I could hear movement all around me, but I of course ignored it. He questioned what it was, but I figured he was just trying to scare me. I continued down the path, and not wanting to be alone, he kept following me. I wasn't paying much attention to what was up ahead of me, making sure I didn't trip on any rocks, and as I panned my head up, in the distance, I could see something crouched behind one of the bushes on that turn. I stopped, and so did he, and I asked him if he saw what I saw. He said he did, and we didn't know whether we should approach it, stay still, or run back. What I had seen was this crouched humanoid figure, maybe 7 to 8 feet tall, with dirty beige skin. Its arms were probably skinnier than branches, and it had no hands. It was a pointy nub. It didn't move at all, so stupidly, I cautiously walked over to it, both of us keeping our lights on. Its head was facing down, and I couldn't hear any noises from it, so when I said, "Hello?" its head jerked up at me, and we both ran as fast as we could. It had very small eyes. Its eyes were black and slim like a coin, and there were holes everywhere on its face. Its mouth almost looks like it was sewn up, but someone had tried to rip it off. We took off running, as he was far up ahead of me, and I had seriously thought that I was going to die. We didn't think, and as we made it out through the entrance, it wasn't behind me anymore, but we kept on running back to my house. We had crashed in my front yard and were scared to death. We almost didn't believe what had just happened was real. We both still had our phones, so we went on to Snapchat and recorded videos at the forest entrance to see if we could not only see that thing again with our lights but also capture it. We didn't, of course. Not yet. I also wish that that's all that happened, but there is, of course, more. To add, there is this old community center that is in front of my home and has been there currently for over 10 years. Anyways, I saw something almost fly over to the center, and I alerted my friend, and he saw it too. Now, on the side of the center, I guess one of the lights was broken because it was flickering that whole night, but we saw whatever it was that had flown over to the center, peeking his head around the corner. We had taken a few photos of it, but I no longer have those photos since I deleted them off of my Snapchat because I wanted to have a new start because of weight loss, but that is unrelated. As well, as my friend suggested that he should just go home now, we had seen this man walking all alone, with nobody else or no light around him, into the forest. He had just appeared out of nowhere, which made us both more unsettled. My friend had claimed he was holding something in his hand, almost long and sharp. A few minutes later, when my friend had left, I heard this female voice screaming from inside the woods. I booked it inside my home and said goodnight to my family before locking myself in my room for the night. We never saw the man again, and we never went into those woods at night ever since. I have also never seen that thing since that night, and I hope that I never do. I am now 18 and still live in the same house, near the same woods. During the day in the woods, nothing strange ever happens there, and it's always such a beautiful place to be, but I now know to stay out of there during the nights. I always hear these noises from inside the woods, but I never bother to venture out. There are brown mountain lights in North Carolina. You can Google it. I found it because I was seeing lights in our woods. We live on 10 acres on the side of a mountain. The house is at the top. Below us are 3 homes in one lot without a house with 10 to 20 acres each, all wooded, and the owners are weekend or a few weeks a year residents. The only entry to the plots is a private road that cuts through our land by our house. I sit outside a lot, so I usually see our neighbors coming or going. It's so infrequent that I will maybe see one car or truck come by during the week. I've seen lights in our woods that don't make sense. This is pretty remote, so if it's an ATV, I'd hear the motor. You can't reach the other lots via ATV from outside the neighborhood due to a river at the bottom and the one old logging road being blocked with a huge tree and a ditch dug out to prevent anyone from going on that overgrown path. I have driven the road that is anywhere down below, and the lights aren't on that road. There is literally a 15-foot high type of wall of earth that is then followed by a steep wooded mountain going up from there. There is no line of sight to my house at all from that road, which is about a mile straight downhill in heavy woods. I have determined some of the lights may have been a neighbor or two walking their driveway to visit with neighbors. Neighbors hang out together many weekend nights when folks are around. But sometimes there is no explanation. It's so quiet that literally, in the fall, I hear leaves falling or the crunch of gravel under the truck, plus motor, if it's driving our road or the road by the river. So I'll see lights and no noise. Again, it's so quiet, etc. I hear squirrels, turkeys, deer, etc. walking through, especially when it's autumn or winter with the leaves on the ground. Some other details: it's typically one light, not 2 headlights, and not a bunch of lights like a group of people. It will be moving horizontally and not floating up like the brown mountain lights. It's pretty bright, like a big flashlight or one headlight, and not what I've read as lights from gas pockets. Also, no dogs barking or anything, which could help rule out hunters trespassing. I've given up on trying to rule out the causes. I suspect it's some light from a human flashlight or car that may be far away, which is unlikely but makes me feel better. Also, the other mountains we look at don't have homes. The closest houses, just a handful, we see are 3+ miles away, as the crow flies, and usually have 2+ mountains between us. I am an avid mountain walker and spend most weekends trekking the mountains and hills of South Wales. I have done this for over 15 years. Within that time, only twice have I ever strange limp that looked like he had to swing his leg around, almost like one leg was shorter than the other. I didn't think much of it. He was actually walking quite fast, so I probably wouldn't have to overtake him. I continued up the track. The sun was overhead, and it was sweltering. The man in front kept limping along, but nonetheless, he was making quick work of the incline. The track started to bend, and I lost sight of the limping man. The track comes up with a choice of two paths: east, which leads to a small parking lot that is rarely used, and west, which leads to the top of the valley. As I was about to head west, I heard a man shout "Duuukik." It was coming from within the forest. I waited a second, and then another outburst: "No!" My first thought was, that guy must have tried taking a shortcut and had fallen over. As I made my way through the thick trees and ferns to see what was up, I stopped dead in my boots. Up ahead, through the trees, I could see the man. He was sitting down on a log with his head in his hands. He then screamed at the top of his lungs, "Arg!" He then bolted up and started punching a tree. His face was bright red, and he was raging. He then picked up a stick and started to bash it against a tree. I was frozen. I couldn't actually process what the hell was going on. He just looked absolutely mad. He shouted, "I hate you," and started stomping his feet. I simply thought, I need to get out of here before he sees me. I quietly started to make my way back to the track, careful not to fall over or make any loud noises. That man was clearly a lunatic. I thought I would go the more rarely used east track and then take a shortcut north through the ferns. This was probably the best way to avoid him. With every step, I became more confident and almost started to laugh about it. Maybe he wanted to let off a bit of steam and vent some anger. The middle of a forest seems like the perfect place, I suppose. So after about 10 to 15 minutes, the ferns started to grow thick and were at chest level. It wasn't a problem because they are fairly simple to push through. As I looked back behind me, I could see the limping man about 25 meters away. He was wading through the ferns towards me. He had a strange snarl on his face, and his head was bobbing up and down between the ferns. I couldn't believe what was happening. He must have seen me. There was no other explanation. I was only a mile away from a main road, so I started to speed up and walk a bit faster. I occasionally looked behind me and could see I was getting further and further away. I started to relax. It's over. I still don't know what to make of the situation, but the fact that he followed me through the ferns was the most disturbing thing. I have done that same walk over a dozen times since, and I haven't seen him again. I grew up in the Arctic. In the town I lived in, as long as it was a clear night, it was an extremely normal occurrence to see all sorts of strange lights move across the sky. Keep in mind that winter is long in the Arctic, which means longer amounts of time are spent under the stars. It's quite beautiful, as long as you don't mind the cold so much. Sometimes I would drive a snowmobile a few kilometers out of town, shut it down, and just lay down on the snow, looking up at the majesty of it all. The only thing disturbing the silence was the occasional breeze. The northern lights are also a common occurrence. It doesn't happen every day, but often enough that they start getting ignored after a while, as long as they aren't too spectacular anyway. On one particular night, without asking my parents, it was their snowmobile, I decided to go on one of my midnight drives out of town. I drove a few kilometers over the hills to find a spot devoid of light pollution from town, shut off the machine, and settled in at a good spot to look up and be retrospective. It wasn't all that interesting a scene. A few satellites passing here and there, some relatively boring activity affecting the magnetic field, etc., and then I started noticing a clicking noise. At first, I thought it was the sound of the snow machine cooling down as the engine expands and contracts a lot in the cold. But the source of the sound definitely wasn't coming from that direction. My next thought was that there must be an animal nearby, in which case I needed to get out of there fast. You don't really want to mess with a wild animal. But the clicking is far too regular for an animal to produce it. It had a fairly mechanical sound. And again, the source of the sound isn't coming from anywhere around me laterally. It was coming from up. So naturally, I look up, determined to ascertain the origin of this strange noise. I see what I always see: stars, northern lights, a lazy satellite crossing the sky, all normal stuff. But before I dismiss it altogether and begin heading home, I notice something strange in the aurora borealis. There were 3 rather strong points of light. I ignored them at first, thinking they were oddly symmetrical stars, but this proved false. They were definitely getting brighter. I kept staring in morbid fascination as they grew stronger and stronger, yet they were still only single points in the sky. All the while, the clicking noise is getting louder and louder and more pronounced, almost like someone started with tapping a pen on a desk to clacking BR balls together inside my head. Then it stops. The lights are gone, the clicking is not heard, and aside from being a little stiff, cold, and rather petrified, I'm fine. So I jump back on the snowmobile, thinking maybe I'm going crazy. The machine takes a little longer than usual to start up, and I'm beginning to worry, but soon it's running, and I'm heading back to town. As I'm driving back, several plausible scenarios as to what occurred are running through my head. I'm thinking it could have been a helicopter from the mine, or some strange northern light behavior, etc. It's probably not that big of a deal. I get pulled up to my house. The lights are all dark. Strange. It wasn't that late when I left. Open the outer door as quietly as possible, remove winter gear, and enter the inner door. The house is quiet. Really quiet. My parents are teachers and are usually up late marking or watching TV. All I'm thinking is that I have to get to bed without anyone noticing. It proves to be easy, as I'm soon under my covers. I go to set my alarm for the next day. All of a sudden, everything makes sense. Engine hard to start, stiff, rather chilly, nobody up when I was gone, what felt like a relatively short period of time. It was almost 11 p.m. when I left, and now it was creeping up to 6 a.m. I stood, staring at clicking lights for almost 7 hours. I never ended up sleeping that night, and I don't go on late-night snow machine rides anymore. I have a couple different ones to share here. I used to be homeless. Returning home, I stayed in the graveyard where my grandpa was buried. There was an open sepulcher that was once used as a storage place for caskets. The racks were still in there. I used to sleep underneath them. I always felt safe in there, though. There was one time, the last night I ever stayed there, I awoke to strange voices, and the room had filled up with frogs. I'm talking at least 20. I kind of viewed it as time to leave. Another time, at another graveyard, I found myself camping one night. Just before I fell asleep, I watched a glowing orb float down from the treetops. A couple of years later, I found myself once again homeless. This time, I'm with my girlfriend. So we got a tent and headed out into the woods. I stayed from October through March of last year. We were never bothered by anyone. It was peaceful, albeit very cold. So one night, there was this heavy feeling in the air. Cops showed up at our camp. They were on a suicide call. It was the middle of winter, and someone had jumped into the river. Very sad. That night, I dreamed of this middle-aged guy hanging out with us in our camp. He let me know that he was the guy who had taken his life. Anyway, it could have been the power of suggestion, but eventually I read it in the paper, and certain details matched up to my dream. Not exactly paranormal, but I figured I would share. The creepiest encounter I ever had in the woods. It goes way back to when I was in 8th grade. My buddy had property in the country. Somewhere along the way, he got it in his mind that there was something living in the woods, some kind of creature. Likely due to some strange bipedal tracks that the neighbors had found. Anyway, being teenagers, of course we camped out and tried to find evidence to see if anything was out there. It always felt like we were being watched and followed. Footsteps, glowing eyes, etc. The happiest night was when we walked to this large, fenced and electric power line tower. We picked up sticks and started banging on the fence because we found some weird hair on it. So we figured we would make a bunch of noise and see if it would attract anything. Nothing came, and we soon lost interest and walked back to his house. Deciding to just stay in for the night. So we had just made it back to his house when, all of a sudden, we started hearing this clanging noise. Something was at the tower, hitting the fence the same way we had been. It sent chills up our spines. When I was 19 or 20, I worked on the local council in Katanning, Western Australia, as a front-end loader operator. A lot of work we would do as expected was road resurfacing and repair, which meant a lot of gravel being carted to various locations throughout the Shire as required. The Shire owned or leased a gravel pit, which was a cleared section surrounded by bush and scrub of a few hectares, about 40 kilometers SE of the town, which was absolutely nowhere near anything or anyone. Even the nearest farmhouse was probably 20 kilometers away, and with only 2 trucks running, it could be over an hour round trip before I was required to be back in the loader, so I used to look around. Nothing exciting other than absolute untouched southwest Australian bush with the occasional animal like rabbits and a fox with quite a few kangaroos. I was an avid hunter back in those days and never cared about going out alone, as I had grown up on farms and enjoyed stalking kangaroos as they are very twitchy, and being with someone usually ended in too much noise. Because I had a key to the gravel pit during work, I returned in the afternoon, parked my car near my front-end loader, collected my rifle and knives, and headed into the bush, probably around 4 p.m. Through quiet movement, I moved steadily further into the bush, looking for kangaroos, but found none. It wasn't until about 6 p.m. that I actually came across some in a clearing. Now it was nearing the end of winter and was actually getting dark, but that didn't really bother me too much as I knew the area and decided to continue. I crouched at the base of a white gum and shot a nice looking doe, which went down nicely, and the rest scattered as expected. I then walked over and set my rifle and gear against a tree and proceeded to bleed and deal with the carcass, which at this time was now dark, but with a full moon and headlamp, I was still happy enough to carry on. It was after I had removed the insides that I heard a distinct crack of a breaking stick, like you would hear in the movies if someone was sneaking up on someone and got caught. I looked around, and with the full moon, I could see pretty well, but I saw nothing, so I continued. It was after I heard a second crack that I really started to pay attention because it certainly wasn't like someone stepped on a twig. It was like someone had quite a large branch and put their knee on it and broke it just out of my range of sight. After a few seconds of dead silence, I walked a few feet, collected my rifle, and loudly cycled the bolt and announced that I was a hunter, and if you were the same or a farmer, now would be the most sane time to own up to prevent getting shot. Nothing. After that silence that rings in your ears, that's louder than a train, I returned to the kangaroo, layered my rifle next to it, and continued on with my duties. After a few more minutes, I know I heard something like it was slowly circling me as I kneeled there and made its way in a circular motion around me, but it was just out of sight in the bush where the moon and headlamp could not reach it. I was starting to actually get really scared, but I reminded myself that there is nothing like bears or wolves in Australia, and especially where I was in Katanning, there were no dingoes or anything else that could harm me besides snakes or spiders. I thought it might be an animal attracted to me because of either the light I was showing off my headlamp or the noise I was making, so I decided to shoot my rifle into the air to see if it would scare it off. I had .308, so in no small way was it a small bang, so I let one off. After my ears stopped ringing, I found that it only worsened the noise of people walking around me, and it now seemed like there were more than one and maybe even 3 people walking around. I then remembered what my Nana said about being alone in the bush in no gear country, and she always had a fire because the light scared the Mummery men away, not sure how it's spelled, and that if you ever took food from their land, it would upset them and they would stalk you, so you had to make sure you offered an offering from your kill, and not a shitbit either, it had to be genuine. Well, at this point, I was shitting myself, so I cut off the kangaroo tail, which is considered the absolute best of the whole animal, and loudly exclaimed that I was very sorry that I came without permission. I offered the best part of the roo, and I hoped I would be forgiven and could return home to my family. I swung that duck and roo tail around my head like a champion Olympic hammer thrower, thrived to miss the large white gums, and heard it land off in the leaves out of sight. And just like that, it all stopped. I did not duck around, and I grabbed the roo's legs, straddled them around my neck, grabbed my shit, and started heading for the care high, which was probably about 15 minutes in a straight line fashion. The whole time, I could hear the crunches and noises of a few things keeping equal distance from me, with the occasional noise right in front of me that would make me stop dead in my tracks and change course. After about an hour, I finally came to the clearing and saw my car, but as I got closer, it only felt like it was watching me more. I chucked the roo in the boot and got in. I nearly cried when the car started, but there was no problem, and I was so happy that when I cleared the windscreen of dew, there was not a duckin' monster standing in front of the car. I can tell you I booked it out of there and nearly duckin' gained when I had to stop to unlock the gate again to get out. It stayed open that night. To this day, I have never gone back to the same area to hunt, and every day I was in that pit loading gravel. After that, I never went exploring again. I was walking my dog outside before putting him to bed around 11 p.m. It's very dark, as there are a lot of wooded areas around my apartment complex. I usually walk him about half a mile or so out of the complex to a stop sign and light post at the end of the street, which borders on the woods. Usually there is nothing out of the ordinary, just wood and normal animals like squirrels and the occasional deer. Sometimes there's that weird, heavy feeling like something is watching you intently, but I mostly ignore it, and we cut our walk short and head home since a brief scan of the area shows nothing is there. Tonight there was that heavy, watched feeling again, but when I scanned the woods, there was something there. A dog with glowing yellow eyes that looked exactly like my dog, down to the heart-shaped white spot on his chest, stood just past the tree line, staring directly at us. It looked like it could be his twin, but there was just something off about it that invoked that feeling of run. My dog definitely saw it, whining and staring at it hard. Usually my dog is reactive to other large dogs, but he seemed more scared than anything else and wanted to get away, which is very abnormal behavior for him. After seeing it, I fought that run feeling and walked quickly but casually back into the gated area and home without looking back, listening very hard for anything coming behind or to the sides of us. Instinctively, It felt like the safest thing to do, I don't know why. It seemed like it didn't follow, but who knows? I do know that I will be skipping nighttime walks for a while, that's for sure. Any ideas on what that might have been? We live in North Georgia at the base of the Appalachians, but I didn't grow up here, so I'm not sure of the local folklore for the most part. I appreciate you listening to this. This actually happened to me when I was a fair bit younger, but a while back, I was solo backpacking on an unfamiliar but really lush, kind of twisty little backcountry trail. I was using a lot of gear I had made from natural stuff, and it was early summer, so I didn't have any hunting licenses, and I didn't have a gun or anything else with me. It was literally just a shortcut I had made and a couple flint knives. I had had a really nice couple days of my trip, and I was encountering nothing but pleasant weather, peace and quiet, and nature in all its glory. Then, on the third day, after I broke for lunch, I noticed movement on the trail behind me. I was carrying a lot of weight in a homemade triangle frame pack as a strength building exercise, but I wasn't going all that fast. I thought at first it was a hiker, so I made a little effort to slow down to let them pass, but they never seemed to catch up. Eventually, that started to become irritating, and that was when I started to notice the movement just off the trail behind me. It was staying behind trees and bushes and around bends, and I couldn't make out what it was. Its silhouette was indistinct, and it was staying behind cover. I couldn't get a square look at it, but the more I looked at it, the more it looked wrong. The torso was weird, too long, no waist, and I couldn't make sense of the glimpses I got of the head. The legs were extremely spindly, and the arms were hunched up or something, or tented in front of it or something. This was mostly on clay, and trails can be hard-packed ground on clay, almost drum-like. Sometimes you can really hear the thump of a footstep, but these were just erratic and so loud. Like slamming a stick down onto the dirt. I called out to it a few times, let it know the time for jokes was over, and knocked it off a few times. Whenever I spoke or yelled, it would just get quiet. Every once in a while there would be a crashing sound from back around where I heard it and a bunch of the thumps, and I kept thinking it was charging me, but then nothing, and a while later I would hear it again from a ways back. This lasted the full rest of the day, and by the time I was breaking for camp, I was starting to be pretty freaked out and pissed off. It was quiet while I set up my tarp and got settled, and as dark fell, I threw some stones behind me, mostly to settle my nerves, and it was silent, so I figured whatever it was over. When I cooked my food, I heard a few very rapid, very loud thumps from a ways behind me and then silence. I was frozen over my dinner for a few seconds, and I could feel my heartbeat in my eyes. I looked back and put my flashlight beam through the bushes for a few moments, and then pretty high, like, taller than I was expecting to look for eyes, I saw two retinas reflect back up, and then a bunch of thumps and crashing and a weird gasping, whistling breathing sound, but like it was going into a big space and a big chest. Kind of high-pitched? From the distance, I heard kind of a gagging cough. I didn't get any sleep that night, I just sat with my back to a big tree and, as a means of defending myself, in my lap. I was not feeling good in the morning, but coffee got me up and running, and I didn't see or hear any more signs of it for a few hours. I had been going west, kind of at an angle to the wind, and the trail I had to switch to started going north, with the wind on my back. That was when I started to smell something awful, and I realized that I must be smelling it because it persisted no matter how long I walked. It was rancid. Rotting flesh or something equally gag-inducing, paired with a kind of musky stink. I've got a strong sense of smell, very strong, and it was making it hard to breathe. Not too long after I smelled that, I started to hear the rustling behind me again and the weird, loud, faltering footsteps. I still had no idea what it was, I kept getting glimpses of it but couldn't make out the color or anything definite. It could have been gray, brown, or patches of reddish brown. I never got a clear enough look at it. I was really freaked out at this point, and I decided, stupidly, to charge at it a little to see if it would take off. I stomped and rushed the bushes a little, and I heard the rapid thumps and crashes again, and then silence again for a while. I am not ashamed to admit that it had freaked me out for long enough that I decided it was just time to put distance between me and it, and I took off down the trail at a fair jog, despite the weight of my pack. I got clear of the stink for a bit, and well, I had run too hard, and my body decided it was a great time to vomit, so I did. I took a breather for a while and then started to really drag myself to my next watering spot, a little brook, and it was no fun at all. It took me most of the day to get there, and I ended up skipping lunch because I didn't want to stop. I ended up deciding to set up camp closer to the water than I usually do. I was determined to get some sleep, but I was still freaked out, so I decided to do something I wouldn't normally do, and I set my hammock up really, really high. Like around 4 or 5 feet off the ground, with my feet a little lower than my body so I could roll out and land on them. I ate my food as quickly as I could, then climbed, as best I could, into my hammock and tried to be as still as I could. I started to doze off almost immediately. An important detail is that I keep my pack on another tree with mine chow over it and my bear locker in a food bag even further away, hanging in a tree. It had been drizzling for a few hours at that point. I don't know how long I slept before I was woken up by this bizarre plastic drumming sound. Really, really loud, paired with the bizarre thumping and weird breathing, and the stench was back big time. It took me a moment to come to it, and then I was in full fight or flight. The noise was so weird. I had one of those little inflatable lanterns hanging off my hammock, so I flicked it on, and I could kind of vaguely see around me, the bushes, and stuff. As soon as the mite went on, the noises all stopped, long enough for crickets to start up their bullshit again. Then I took rapid steps, and the thing popped through the foliage into the little area where I had set up my tarp and hammock, and I could see it more clearly for the first time. It was long-torsoed and thin-legged and moved lurchingly, weird two big head apparently pierced through with a branch or something and lolling, arms apparently outstretched in front of it, and I could see its eyes reflecting back at me, greenish-yellow. I got that much of a glance and dropped down to the ground in my bare feet with my hatchet in hand. When I looked it up, I finally recognized it. It was a mule deer buck, covered in sores and dirt and skeletally thin, stumbling around on its hind legs and going from tree to tree, snapping at leaves, or something that wasn't there. Its breathing was super ragged and weird, and its head was very floppy on its neck. As it got closer to me, it fell down, making the crashing sound it had made before, and then struggled back up. When it noticed me, it froze, pissed a bunch, and then took off into the bushes. I would have laughed if I hadn't been so relieved and tired. I went to inspect my food bag, and it looked like I hadn't tied it well or high enough as it was down leaning against the trunk of the tree, and it had had the ever-loving shit kicked out of it. There were bent and scuffed bits all over my beer locker. I figure it must have had CWD or something, but Christ did that duck with me. I marked a few spots with Eric's pushed into the mud so I could find the tracks in the morning, dried off, and slept for a few hours. I ended up searching around the place for a while in the morning, and it had already been muddy as I was putting up my shelter. Here's the thing, I found deer prints from where they had come in and left, but outside my clearing, from the direction I had heard them coming, I only found one print, a lot smaller than my feet. I'm size 11 and flat-footed, with a high arch and only 3 toes, and it was deep, deeper than my prints. There were no other tracks I could find. I caught the rotting meat smell a few more times on the way back. I was supposed to go 2 days further in and then turn around, but I decided to just head back to my car. I actually heard the thumping as I was getting back to where I parked, and I ended up hustling the rest of the way. To be honest, I haven't hiked on that trail since. This happened to my mom. A few months ago, in rural Montana, my mom took her dog outside to potty in the middle of the night. She had a big yard, and her dog would go off leash. While she waited for her dog, my mom said that she heard a strange whistling. She would have thought it was a human, but whatever it was didn't seem to need to breathe. The sounds were continuous. She described it as a combination of every dog whistle you could imagine all at once. She was convinced that some creature was attempting to lure her dog into the wilderness. Luckily, the dog didn't seem to react to the sound and returned to her after doing its business. A few days prior, my mom and stepdad had been rockhounding near their home, and they saw what looked like 2-footed dog tracks going across the road that had an 8-foot stride. She thinks that this might have all been the work of a dog man, the cryptid dog that walks upright on 2 feet. As a child, she had a Bigfoot encounter. She is terrified of and believes in the existence of cryptids because of this. When I came to visit her this summer, she would not let me take the dog out after dark, and she would not do it either. She very frantically and emphatically made me promise not to go out after sundown. There were several strange occurrences at her home over the summer that I saw for myself. She is still seeking out other stories and experiences like hers to shed light on what might have happened, but so far she has been unable to find any stories like hers. If you or someone you know has experienced whistling like that, please share. I live in the rural, Midwestern part of the US. Now, if I had only seen an orb once, I would probably write it off as being too tired, stressed, etc. I see them nearly every morning and every evening. They only appear when I think of them. Which is freaky. Then there can be different colors, ranging from red to amber or gold to bright white to blue. They have appeared to my wife also. They appear in the middle of the woods at night or when it's dark. There's only a farmer and his enormous field behind those woods, and nothing in between. They are not man-made lights because you can clearly see the two that the farmhouse is on at night, and they are constantly on, not blinking or fading in and out like the orbs. They are not drones, no sound, and like I said, they only appear when I think of them, and they appear nearly instantly, Plus there's no one to operate them out here. I'm pretty stumped on rational or scientific thinking or debunking. After seeing my first UFO, I started seeing these orbs. And it's been pretty endless ever since. I have no idea who I'm communicating with. Or how. While it doesn't feel malicious, I honestly could be fooled by anything paranormal considering all the stories of shape-shifting and whatnot. I've also heard tales of fairies, yes, fairies, and how they can be tricksters, appearing as different things. Same with Bigfoot, spirits, etc. Even tree spirits are a culprit. They also seem to have different behaviors. There are ones that blink so bright and others that are more dim. Some are high in the trees, some more at human height. Some seem to respond to a question, but it is not always the same answer every time. Some fade and dim at irregular intervals, and some only blink in an almost automated fashion or at regular intervals. The red light likes to blink for a long amount of time. I once counted over 200 regular intervals, then it will stop for a while and let others talk. I've even had an experience when I was driving home and I glanced at the woods behind my house, and they lit up all in a row quickly, like the lights on a taxiway. Like they were excited I was home or something. What are these things? Plasma balls? Vehicles? Consciousness? Are they more than one thing? Is it normal that they attempt to communicate so frequently? How do I know if I'm truly communicating back? I was just looking for some shared experiences, specifically regarding light orbs. This was 4 years ago, when I was 15 on a muzzleloader mule deer hunt in the far northeastern part of Utah, which contains some of the most remote, and beautiful, places in the state. I've been frequently out in this area spreading in Summit County that cuts in and out of lower Wyoming since before I can remember, including lots of hiking, backpacking, camping, hunting, and being involved in some of my grandfather's work. I am skeptical of things not proven by methods of science, but I don't deny all of those things. I find that it's impossible for science to know all that is out there in our vast world. My grandfather is a recently retired biologist and former conservation officer for the state. And was a regional specialist and was over wildlife and habitat management for many years. He's done everything from habitat management programs, controlled fires to benefit areas, to quite literally wrangling moose to be transplanted and darting black bears. He has seen mountain lions, bears, birds of all kinds, small mammals, ruminants, plants, and natural phenomena for the majority of his life, and he understands so much that many people, including myself, will never be able to even imagine. He's scientific, honest, straightforward, and level-headed. He's agnostic, not superstitious, and often used to, lovingly and respectfully, tease a certain CO who thinks certain Bigfoots, skinwalkers, and other beings exist. Other than this experience, he has never encountered an animal that he could not at least partially, if not completely, identify, and other than the natural, innate fear of being in close quarters with a bear, a drunken and belligerent hunter, or incredibly potent tranquilizer medication. He's told me over and over that he's never been terrified of an animal or experience like this, only curious or surprised. It was late September, and we were in a small camp by a lake in the high Uinta Mountains, hunting both grouse and mule deer with muzzleloaders. The camp was a small collection of men and women my grandfather had worked with over the years as a supervisor, biologist, or CO, and these were people I grew up with. One of the women, a new wife to one of the guys, had shot a buck deer, injuring but not killing it immediately, and they had lost track of it. Devastated by the thought of wasting the animal, she returned to camp in the afternoon, upset and concerned that the deer had run into an even more secluded area of the mountain, which was difficult to reach from the trail that she had shot from, a place my grandfather was familiar with because it was such a pain in the ass to get to, with lots of deadfall and steep terrain. We volunteered to go in the late afternoon to search for the deer, following a scant blood trail that she had tracked for a while before getting fatigued and intimidated by the terrain. Because both my grandfather and I were in good shape and he was so familiar, it didn't seem like a big deal. Before we left, she mentioned hearing what she assumed were coyotes, which made her even more concerned that if the deer died, they would ruin the meat and hide before she could harvest it. We took off in the early evening, expecting to be back within an hour or two after searching and having our guns with us, in case we found the animal still alive or came across another buck worth trying to harvest. It was steep in places, with lots and lots of deadfall of varying heights, making the hike slower and more tedious than we had hoped, making us understand the other hunters' fatigue. She had marked the blood trail with bright orange pieces on the trees, which we followed for maybe 20 minutes, and then it got hard to track. The sun was getting close to setting at this point, and we knew getting out would be just as long as getting in. We had just about decided to stop when we found a spot near a fallen tree that looked like it had been recently bedded down in, followed by spatters of fairly fresh blood, and we continued for longer. When the sun had just about set and the light had faded from the trees, we removed the firing caps from our guns to make them completely safe, as it was now illegal and irresponsible to hunt in such an absence of decent light. My grandfather pulled out his large mag light flashlight from his pack, and I put on my headlamp to begin the hike back, using our GPS to find the trailhead. About 10 minutes on the way back, we started to hear more movement among the trees. It was normal for animals to start moving now that the sun had gone down, as creatures would likely be starting to head towards clearings for water or to graze in the safety of lower light. Small and distant sounds of crunching leaves, patterings of hooves from animals, or small bits of movement in the trees from squirrels or birds were common and expected. We did not expect the deafening, disturbing sound we heard next, which vaguely and initially reminded me of a coyote howl, but by a few seconds in, it was unidentifiable, frightening, and human-like. It started with what sounded like a person screaming, but then got louder and more intense, with a screech to it. So unlike any coyote or any animal we had ever heard of, then was the almost chittering that came in between the shrieks, and the movement of the trees became almost calculated, almost threatening. We stopped dead in our tracks, frozen, as my grandfather started using the light to look around. I was far more freaked out than him at this point. He just seemed perplexed, curious, and a little baffled at what could make that sound. It sounded human, but with no words, with no urge or tone of help or "I'm just screaming to mess with you." We continued on after it mostly stopped, and it seemed like the other natural and distant sounds had gone almost silent. I listened intently to the sound of my boots crunching with the dry aspen leaves underfoot, trying to tell myself that it was just some weird coyote with a horribly deformed larynx or something. Maybe 20 minutes from the main trail that would lead us to the truck, we heard the chittering sound again and sounds of thumping against dead trees. Looking around with our lights, in between dead falls, maybe 12 to 15 feet in front of us, was a large human-looking thing. It was almost hunched down with a long, slender arm around the front of a standing aspen. The aspen, of course, was pale white, with the knots being dark brown, and whatever it was had skin almost as pale. I caught a very brief glimpse of its face. It seemed round, and the eyes seemed sunken, and I could not tell you a color other than a flash of reflection on the eye from my light, and that its face seemed sunken and emaciated. I didn't see any fur or hair. I never felt like it looked right at me, more like my grandfather, and just in our direction, almost confused and curious, like he was before with the sound. For a mere couple of seconds, I caught a glimpse of it, but that was it. I looked down at the ground, holding my eyes shut tight, trying to imagine being safe and secure in the truck, and my grandfather took a few stumbling steps backward toward me. I heard the thing go off to our side, moving quickly and with purpose through the trees, and then drop down behind us, according to the sound. But I hope it went in the opposite direction. My grandfather turned to where it had veered off so as to follow it, but he soon stopped and looked at me. I had never before and never since seen him so confused, baffled, horrified, curious, and in awe. I was crying at this point, ugly crying, trying to muffle my shaking breath and voice, and I asked him, "What was that?" Over and over, I asked, and he had no answer for me. He pulled his gun off his shoulder, sling, and put a cap back on the nipple of the igniter, making the gun live, and he then carried it in front of his body and his arm. He pulled out another headlight to put on himself. We started walking again towards the trail, as he listed off as like talking to himself as to what it wasn't, things like I couldn't have been a deer, elk, or moose, it had hard arms, it was hunched, it stood upright, or a bear? A very sick bear? It could have been a bear. Was it the light? We heard the sound, the screeching human howl distantly once more, before reaching the trail, which was dirt and gravel but fairly flat with no deadfall. We practically jogged to the truck. I locked the doors immediately and sobbed, and my grandfather turned on music as loud as possible to try to distract me on the way back to camp. I was a mess when we arrived back, and he went to talk with the others by the fire when he got me settled in my sleeping bag in my bunk. He explained some to his friends, but I don't know what all was said. The next day, everyone was extra sweet to me, trying to comfort me and saying that it was probably a sick animal that looked scary in the dark. The deer the hunter shot was found the next day in the daylight, scavenged quite harshly by what I assume were coyotes. To this day, he has no clue what it was or what that sound was, and before and since, I've heard both coyote and many other animal sounds that were never even compared to that sound. The scientist in me and in him, the hopeful and blissfully ignorant people in us, hope and speculate that it was just a deformed, sick animal in scant light, but I still have no clue what that thing was, and I hope I never ever experience it again. Anyone have any ideas? I was never going to share this. But I happened across a story here the other day that really shook me, and I'm hoping for more information. This happened a few months ago. I live in Wisconsin. Just outside of Milwaukee, so still pretty urban/suburban, But we've got quite a few Bigfoot believers up north. I'm currently living alone in my old childhood house. There's miles of woods behind it, and I played in them alone all the time from a truly inappropriately young age. Nothing overly weird. I'm old enough now that I like to pregame bedtime with an evening nap. Mostly to keep from saying I'm going to bed at 7. But I'll get up a little after midnight or so and finish my day. One night I really overshot it and woke up about 2:45 a.m. I'm taking my dog outside and listening to the family of owls that nest by the woods, but he's just staring at the darkness and growling. Now we have raccoons, coyotes, and all the normal stuff coming out at night. He's only done this a couple times in his life, but my mind still jumps to normal. As a woman living alone, though, it's worth paying attention to. But then I hear a sound. To my ear, it sounds like me. More specifically, a tiny me, calling my brother's name in this stupid way I used to do when I was really little. Consciously, I think, wow, I definitely misheard that. What a weird thought to bring up. And I set out trying to figure out what possible thing I could have heard that could in any way be misconstrued as a little girl's voice from the dark at 3 a.m. leaves? Some weird bird? But I'm standing there, and the undercurrent of weird starts playing underneath my grown adult thoughts. What about all those skinwalker stories? But you're supposed to hear your loved one's voice calling your name, not your voice from 30 years ago calling their name, right? Which led to a chilling thought of just how long something had to be back there watching me to come up with that sound. But overall, my illogical logic was sound. I still haven't moved. My puppy hasn't stopped growling. Then the owls hooted again. This is the most basic owl sound ever. Followed immediately by this deep, sort of masculine, humanish voice mocking them. Delicately until I read on here the other day that multiple people have stories about something imitating an owl. Someone said that baby owls make that sound because they haven't learned to hoot properly yet. I've listened to that owl family for years and never heard that. But I spent a lot of time researching baby owl sounds, hoping that was the answer here. All I could find were videos of them screeching. It was a very creepy sound, but nothing like what I heard. Could someone confirm for me either way, please? 9 out of 10 love living alone, but this is kind of throwing a wrench into my lifestyle here. To start this off, me and my fiancée were planning a trip to Utah for about a month. It was kind of an impulsive decision, but she wanted to visit her dad's grave in Delta, Utah. We just got home to Colorado today. Looking back on the trip, nothing went right, and so many weird things happened. On the way to the Airbnb we booked in Monty, we saw many angel numbers. She's very spiritual. I'm a little skeptical, but everything felt normal for the most part. One thing I noticed was how many deer signs I saw, but I hadn't seen a single deer at all. Once we got to the airport, I personally started to feel weird. I know that town is very Mormon, and I've never had any problems with them. I think everyone has a right to their own beliefs, and I respect that. But the way the town felt around the temple was eerie, to say the least. While we're in the air, something feels off. She used her pendulum to try and talk to her dad, but a spirit wouldn't let her get through to anyone. This spirit was Mormon, and she told us to leave, and we weren't welcome. Just for context, we are both women and have many tattoos and piercings, and I am Native American. I felt a gut-swelling feeling at this point, and I asked her to ask if reading a portion of the Mormon Bible would make the spirit more comfortable with us staying there. She said yes, and I read a little bit before we left to get dinner. We decided to get Denny's right outside Monty, and when we walked in, the servers kind of just stared at us for a good few minutes until I stared back for a while. That's when they decided to come and give us a table. I had a weird vibe from the people there, but I didn't make a fuss because I'm sure we looked different, especially in a small town coming from Denver. Once we got our food, I almost immediately felt sick after eating. I took only 3 bites before feeling sick. I thought maybe it was because we had been on the road literally all day, but as soon as we got back to driving to the airport, I threw up. We instantly chalked it up to car sickness until I had my fiancée try a piece of my food, and she began to feel sick almost immediately as well. Yet her food was perfectly fine, and we got almost the exact same meal. We decided at that point not to eat out anymore and to use the money for food at the grocery store. So we left once more. We went to the nearest Walmart, and that experience was mostly normal besides the stares and weird glances we got. As we drove up to the Airbnb, my stomach began to sink again. I swear I saw what looked like a human face in a bush next to the garage door. I felt a cold sweat, but we decided to go inside and just try to relax. Once we were inside and getting ready for bed, we saw bugs over and over again. Almost like the cottage was infested with spiders and earwigs. At that point, my fiancé and I decided we had enough of that town, and we booked a hotel room for that night. It was around 11 p.m. when we left, maybe a little earlier. The hotel was about 40 minutes away. The drive was alright at first until it took us to a dirt road with nothing at all around us. At this point, my mom had called us worried about us being out late in a foreign state. We stayed on the phone to calm our nerves. As we drove, a series of events played out. First, a black cat ran right across the road in front of our car. I was more freaked out about this because of that old saying, on top of everything else that had happened that night. As we drove, there were no street lights or signs, and my phone kept losing service, so we relied on Apple Maps to get us there. A little ways in, I saw a huge cow sitting on the side of the road just laying there. There wasn't a single other cow around him, or any other animal for that matter. And looking back on it now, I didn't see its eyes, the car lights didn't reflect his eyes, and he was really close. Almost seconds later, on the other side of the same road, I saw a giant white figure that almost resembled a horse, but the legs were too skinny, it had no head, and it moved almost like it glided. I came to find out that my fiancée saw what looked like a man walking to our car as soon as we got on the dirt road and didn't say anything because she was scared. I didn't say anything about the figure I saw either because I know speaking it out is a bad idea, especially at night, and I didn't want to scare my fiancée. Once we got to the hotel, the gut sinking was gone, and we felt better. But I had a horrific nightmare about my mom dying and crawling around the ceiling like something out of a grudge, and when I woke up, my fiancée blamed the road for my dream. I think she was mostly joking, but I'm starting to think she was right. This just happened a few days ago, so it's still fresh in my mind, but I wanted to share this because I wanted to know if anyone knows what happened that night or if that town has something wrong with it, literally anything. It all began in November 2019. It was just me, my brother, and a friend hanging out outside. We were just circling around the neighborhood when we decided to go into the forest. We go in, and we find a stroller, a crate, and other weird things I forgot about. Frantic, we tell the other kids in the neighborhood about this, though they probably don't care. Obviously weirded out, we spent months until COVID hit investigating that forest. But there was one time we still can't explain. It was January 2020. Me, my brother, and two friends. We were at the park when we decided to go to the forest again. The park was shaped with the basketball court in the front, the playground in the back, and behind the playground was an opening in the trees, where you enter and you reach the playground. Anyway, we went through there on our bikes to the street and into the forest. We reach the forest, and as we are walking in, I see something move in the distance, so I zoom in with my iPhone camera to try and see what it is, but my friend said it was just a branch. Until 5 seconds later, something started chasing us. Terrified, we scream and run away. Ever since then, my memory has gotten hazy, so I do not remember what it looked like, and we didn't take a video because we were terrified. It looked like some Civil War era soldier on a horse. My brother said it was a prisoner, but to this day, we do not know what it was. We never went back in after that, and nobody believed us. In August 2020, I moved away. And I didn't go visit until March of this year. I actually found one of my friends playing basketball, and he remembered the forest. Although he wasn't the exact same person with us that day, anyway, he left. So it was me, my brother, and a random old lady. Remember what I said about how the park was shaped? In front of the basketball court, there's a mildly steep and grassy area. I shot and missed the hoop, so my ball rolled around, and as I was grabbing it, I saw a lady crouched with a baby for 1 second, and it just disappeared. Mind you, this was around 6 or 7 p.m. not dark, but not necessarily light. I told my brother, then around a minute later, I grabbed the basketball from there again when my brother started screaming, so we ran into our parents' car and drove off. He said he heard stuff in the bushes, and I did too. I also heard whispering and footsteps. It hasn't been the same since that day in January 2020. I think there were Satan worshippers in our neighborhood, because there was this one time I was just standing around while my brother and our friends went into the forest, and they came back with photos of a hanging yellow raincoat and chairs all around each other. Like a group. Then there was another time. Me, my brother, and friends were exiting the forest, like any other day after school, when these teenagers came in, and I don't remember what we said, but they responded with, "We pray here," which most likely explains the chairs and everything else we saw. But I still do not know what went on in that forest. Even 2 years later. What was this mysterious flashing light in the woods? I don't even know if it was paranormal, but it was sure as shit freaky. I have been thinking about this for the past week nonstop, and I need an answer, so I will try to spare as little detail as possible and get all the information out before I go through the encounter. I live in Northeast Florida, sort of near Jacksonville. The time was around 11 to 12 at night, near pitch black. The light was white and very small. We were near our car with all lights turned off, which could not have possibly been a reflection. We couldn't pick up the light at all on cameras, no matter how bright or obvious it seemed. With all that out of the way, I'll start the recounting. Me and a buddy were smoking some weed in the middle of the woods, just chilling. When we see a light in the woods, about 5 feet off the ground and fully stationary, we don't really think much of it, we just watch it while we continue talking. About 3 seconds after we first saw it, the light went away and came back as if it were blinking, then slightly moved to the left. Needless to say, me and my boy were freaked the duck out and basically got in the car and left. Curiosity got the better of us, so we picked up another friend, hoping to freak him out too. About 20 minutes later, we are back on the spot, watching from all sides with cameras out, trying to get it on film. This time, I witnessed it come from deeper in the woods to get closer. Imagine a light tunnering on and off, getting even closer each time, until it was right next to us and flashed way brighter than we had seen before. The closest thing I could describe it to would be like a laser shining directly at us, and once again, we drove away screaming. Now I know it was dumb, considering we seemed to piss this thing off, but we came back for a third time determined to stay and study whatever this was. About 10 minutes pass, and we watch it come back through the woods and flash right next to us. This time, after not leaving, it lets out like 3 to 4 stationary flashes and then starts moving around more or less like a flying bug but is still flashing. We let that happen for about 2 minutes and left after we thought we had seen enough. I have never really believed in the paranormal, so if there is any scientific answer, please let me know, but I feel like this is something that cannot be rationally explained. I have also obviously put in my own work to research this, but I can't find anything that matches the exact description of what we saw. Any information would be appreciated. The true story of the Night Marchers. This story is 100% true, whether you believe me or not is up to you. When I replay these events in my head, I often wonder if they're true or not. I don't know where to begin with this story, it all just seems too surreal for me and my 3 friends. Since this incident happened 4 years ago, no one has really spoken about it, since in fact, what happened on the island of Hawaii was actually the one incident that almost broke our friendship. I'm 25 years old, and I love the outdoors. In fact, I loved the outdoors so much that I started a club in high school called the Outdoor Grizzlies. It was a very small group of us who would set up different hiking trips to go on. We have hiked all the way to the beautiful Sleeping Giant State Park trails in Connecticut and all the way to Julia Pfeiffer Burns State Park in California, which has a fantastic 80-foot waterfall with lavish scenery. In this group of my fellow friends are my best friend since middle school named Jake, my good friend I met freshman year of high school, Jennifer, and lastly but not least, Jake's girlfriend since high school, Christine. We were inseparable and went on all of our hiking trips together in high school. We held fundraisers with permission from the school. I believe the school saw how much we loved nature, so much so that we would make a career out of it, so they gladly allowed us to take it a step further, with permission from our parents, of course. We were all in shape for the most part, which is part of the reason why we also loved doing what we did. It freed our minds, gave us clarity, and took away our anxiety. Often, you hear or have experienced yourself being a teenager riddled with anxiety and depression, walking an uphill path of uncertainty. But that wasn't us. We even had a few of our teachers go hiking locally, and they have told us how inspired they were and how it helped them with their anxiety and stress as well. After we graduated from high school, things sort of died down with the club. We all kept in touch, but as happens to most people after high school, life happens. The only one I really kept in touch with was obviously my best friend, Jake. He was still with Christine, but she and I barely spoke because hiking wasn't just in our blood anymore. Jennifer did her own thing and was seeing this college jock named Robert, so we, with the expedition of Jake, really just drifted. A few years had passed, and one evening in May, I decided it was nice enough to throw a bonfire. Just a few friends. Christine didn't really want to just hang around people she didn't know, so she came up with the idea to invite Jennifer. Through the power of social media, Jennifer was actually very happy. She talked about how life got in the way, and she and Robert broke up, so the bonfire was just what she needed so she could play catch up with us all, just like in old times. She told me her number was still the same and to call her to confirm. That went easier than I thought, and suddenly I was filled with happiness and excitement. Just like old times, the laughter, the jokes, this was something I wish I had done sooner. We had the bonfire, and it went off without a hitch. It was approximately around 1:30 a.m. It was just us after everyone else left, myself, Jake, Jennifer, and Christine. The cool spring breeze embraced my neck, and the fire kissed my nose, leaving me with goosebumps. Jake had mentioned how peaceful and nostalgic this was as he downed the tail end of his beer. The energy around our group was just so nice. And Jennifer mentioned how I once slipped on a wet rock trying to run away from an unusual bug, which was named the bug incident. We all laughed, and Jake said, if only we could relive those days and go back? Christine looked at Jennifer and said, what if we can relive those days, but we don't have to go back to relive them? So we formed a plan. Jake's aunt was a flight attendant. I had a rainy day of fun with a generous amount of money. Jennifer saved money for a trip she was going to take on her own, and Christine had a decent online following for makeup, so she was sure she could crowdfund. After 3 weeks, we combined our finances, and we were able to afford this trip. And we were going to stay around the Honolulu area because there was a very well-known hiking place there with a beautiful waterfall. We arrived at our destination, and boy were we excited. We decided we would be tourists the first 3 days, and the last 3 days we would spend hiking around the area, and we would use the 7th day to get ready to leave. We wanted to take it a step further. We wanted to camp out in the area. We have done it before, so we know what to do, and we were very well versed in camping and hiking, so we had experience and felt like we could take this on. We made our way deeper and deeper into the forest. We saw people along the way. We spoke to a few tourists and a few friendly locals, and then we began to notice how much more isolated it became. Christine had said we seemed far away, and we didn't have any signal on our phones. She bought a compass and map, so she said we should just find a place around the area we were in. We all agreed. We found a beautiful place. It was like it was waiting for us. It was on a cliffside, looking over almost the entire island. We didn't realize how far we had hiked. And it was relatively safe. There was a fence made of bamboo, so you really couldn't fall unless you purposely threw yourself over the fence, but even then, there was a big enough rock protruding out so you couldn't fall and basically die. It was really the most magnificent view I've ever seen. We set up the one tent we had, set up some lanterns around, and made a final fire to keep away the insects. Jennifer decided to go with Christine to explore the area while Jake and I were setting up. Christine yelled, "Hey!" We heard her clearing some bush. She said, "Stairs?" I thought she was just imagining it, and she said, "No, guys, come on, look." They looked pretty worn. But they led to that piece of rock on the bottom. To put it in a better perspective for you, the reader, picture Pride Rock from The Lion King. We were standing on the flat piece, and then imagine another flat piece on the bottom of that with stairs that wrapped around to get to the bottom. Instead of throwing yourself over the bamboo fence, kidding, Jennifer was against going down the worn steps because she was afraid someone might get hurt. But we had to know where these stairs led to. What if it was treasure? An artifact? Jake and I decided to go, and the girls could stay. The stairs in the beginning were made of stone and were worn, but once we got to the middle of the steps, it wasn't as bad. We finally got down and saw that it was the piece of rock on which we were standing, like on the upper level, minus the forest. It was like a cave. We made our way into the cave, and we could hear our footsteps crushing broken coconut shells and sand grit. Jake took his flashlight and lit up the inside. We were amazed. There seemed to be drawings on the walls, and what looked like a burial site. It looked disturbed, but the drawings were what intrigued us. I lit my flashlight and pointed it at the wall. We were able to make out bodies and very tiny heads. The walls looked untouched, and we carefully swept the debris from the wall. We needed more light to understand the carvings. We called the girls, and reluctantly, they came. We asked them to light their flashlight and point it at the wall. We all did at the same time, and they were just as amazed. We took photos, and we said at the end of our trip we would let the information desk know about this place. Maybe we have discovered something no one has ever done. Christine said, "Wait a minute, it seems like these carvings tell a sequence of events from right to left." As we looked at these carvings, we just saw what looked like a figure pushing someone off a ledge. We immediately got the chills and decided to head back up. Jake broke the silence and said, "Remember, this was thousands of years ago. It was part of history." Jennifer replied, "Yeah, but it's just still creepy." We all agreed that if it were to rain, we would seek refuge in the cave. We decided to go look around, not too far from the campsite, but just explore. We were all inspired since we stumbled across that carving on the wall. Maybe we can find something else. We were about 15 minutes into our walk when we realized the sun was beginning to set. Christine brought up the fact that we should probably head back. We don't want to get caught out here in the dark. It would make things harder for us. We all decided to head back. As we were heading back, we heard rustling and sticks breaking. Christine grabbed Jake, and Jennifer locked her arm with mine. Jake looked at me in bewilderment and said, "Are you an animal?" I said no, whatever it is has a heavy foot. Jake had a military-grade knife and had his hand on it. Jennifer had her mace. The branches were sounding louder and louder, so we froze. We braced ourselves on the defensive, just in case. Suddenly, The big leaves parted, and a man who looked like a native Hawaiian with a straw hat and one of those touristy-looking Hawaiian shirts emerged from the bushes. He said it in a stern voice. "Why are you in these parts?" We explained that we are hikers from the mainland, and we have a campsite not too far from here on a rock. We also mentioned the strange markings we saw on the cave walls. His eyes suddenly widened, and it felt like they pierced our souls. He said he's going to give you advice from one human being to another. We just stood wide-eyed with nothing to say, listening intently and waiting for what he would tell us. He said you should not sleep there, you should pack your things and leave. Many bad things happened in this area for millennia since the Golden Age was broken. A curse has been cast on this sacred land, and it would be foolish for you to stay here. Jennifer said with a knot in her throat, "Why?" The man said, "The nightmares." He then said, "Poe approaches. Get somewhere safe. And whatever you do, don't look them in the eye." And he went off. We all looked at each other. Jake said, "Did we really come all this way to leave?" We decided it was only going to be one night, and dusk is approaching. As soon as the morning comes, we'll pack and leave. We just won't touch anything. So we made our way back to the campsite. When we finally got back, Jennifer remembered that she bought a pot and 2 cans of clam chowder with pita bread. We lit the fire, put the pot over the fire, heated up our food, and enjoyed a decent dinner. It was one of the best nights we had since our high school days hiking. Christine looked at her watch and noticed it was 12:45 a.m. I'll never forget that time because it was the night from hell. We decided to get ourselves ready to sleep. 2 people can fit in one tent, and since it was so beautiful outside and Jennifer and I admired the stars, we decided to lay out and fall asleep under the stars. I remember thinking to myself, I only see skies like this on wallpaper for my computer, it was just so magical. I dozed off. I remember waking up to use the bathroom. There was really no bathroom, so I decided to go into the woods. I remember it being silent, no animals making noises, no insects, nothing. It was eerily quiet out. It was like time had stopped. I quietly walked behind the tent into some bushes to release. Suddenly, I heard a horn. I'm not sure what it was, but it sounded like a horn. I just passed it off as me hallucinating and headed back to sleep. Suddenly, as I was drifting back off, I heard what sounded like a drum. My finger tapped the ground with each beat of the drum. It began to get louder and louder. Jake woke up and peeked outside the tent. He looked at me and said, "How do you have service up here to watch a movie? Turn it down, man." I said, "Jake, that's not me." Now, if you knew Jake, when he would be very serious with me, he would call me by my full name, Thomas. He said, "Thomas, stop joking and go to bed. You know we have to get up early to leave." He rubbed his eye, looking at his Apple Watch. Suddenly, a horn noise went off again, and it was even louder. Jennifer sat up and said, "Okay, the prank isn't funny or cool." Suddenly it sounded louder, and the drum was getting closer and closer. Christine was fast asleep in the tent. Suddenly, when we thought we were cornered, it went silent. All you could hear were our heartbeats. We were frozen looking at one another, and I gave Jake the look like we had made a plan, and we nodded to one another like we knew what to do. Jake slowly went back into the tent, and you can hear him whisper Christine. Christine. Follows by a soft yay? Is it time to get up? I looked at Jennifer, and she seemed to be in a daze. I motioned to her to grab her bag, but she wasn't moving. She looked like she was moving her mouth, but nothing was coming out. I broke out of my fright and went up to her and said, "What's wrong? We have to go." She lifted her shaking arm, and her half pointed behind me. I grabbed her arm and said, "What?" In an angry whisper, she said, "Behind." My breath shook, and I slowly turned behind me. I can hear Jake getting things together in the tent, and as I turned around, this was the part that scared me to the core. My fight or flight kicked in, and I barely remember anything else. I saw a tall man, at least 6 feet tall, with a machete, but that's not what scared me, it was his head. It was very small, he had what looked like a coconut shell for armor, with eyes cut out for holes and a small hole for the mouth. His body looked normal, but his head was as big as a coconut. Jennifer screamed, and Christine and Jake came out and froze in fear. I immediately pushed Jennifer away from looking at this monster. "This thing," she snapped out, got up, grabbed me, and ran. Jake and Christine followed. We didn't know where we were going or which direction we were going in. We left everything. We heard footsteps, branches breaking like if there were like 10 of them following, just cutting the branches coming down like nothing. I don't know how we got through the forest, but Christine noticed a strong river of water, and we figured we could lose them if we crossed. We all jumped in and started making our way through, but it just kept getting deeper, and before we knew it, The river overpowered us and carried us. I looked back, and I saw 5 of those beings with a variety of weapons in their hands. They stopped following us. They just stared at us. I kept looking, and I will never forget seeing these people. I don't know. Beings with average height but small heads. I passed out. I woke up with the sun in my face and Christine hitting my face. She had a gash on her head, Jake, and the rest of us all had scratches and bruises all over our bodies. Before we could even talk, we heard a helicopter over us. They came and airlifted all of us to the island nursing triage to get checked out. I asked the guy, "How did you find us?" He said that individual's Apple Watch sent us coordinates at 4:55 a.m. "We've been looking for you for 4 hours." Because it wasn't easy getting to where we were. Christine just cried, and Jennifer hugged her. Jake and I looked at one another. The guy added that we shouldn't have been there, and we were way off the path. The local authorities came to speak to us and ask what happened, and I told them everything, from the drawings to the strange men with small heads. He went on to explain that that's just folklore. But people get so frightened of the nightmares that they end their lives because their minds can't take what they see. They have only had 2 instances of documented suicides. One was a 19-year-old girl who jumped off the rock cliff we were camping at, and the other person was called off the search because authorities refused to search when night approaches. The area was closed off to the public when they found 4 headless bodies in the 1980s. And the perpetrator was never found. He continued, "We must have been way off the trail to be by that rock area because it's completely closed off." They seemed puzzled at how we even got there to begin with. As I felt chills run down my spine, I wondered. Did we actually go into the river to escape, or did we try to end our lives? And what was under that coconut shell? Was there even a head at all? But how could they breathe? Or see? I asked the officer taking our statement, "Do the nightmares have heads?" He said, "Since you're alive to tell the tale, they didn't remove their coconut shell. But had you died and jumped off the cliff, you, like the young girl, would have known that answer for yourself." We decided to take a very long break from hiking or camping. Instead, we just meet up at a bar. No one really talks about it. But I don't want to wonder what a head the size of a coconut looks like. This was in MA, not in SoCal. There's this trail that leads down to a river that is well maintained but never busy. About 2 miles. I used to hike it frequently. So one time I was about a mile in, and I got that feeling that someone was watching me. You know that feeling? But I couldn't see anyone else on the trail or in the woods. I decided to keep going because it was a hot day and I wanted to jump in the river at the end of the trail. About a half mile after I started feeling like I was being watched, I found a severed doe head in the center of the trail. Clean cut, no blood. Just there. Was not an area known for hunting either. I was so close to the river that I just bolted and waited on the dock for a couple of hours to see if anyone would come out after me. I felt like I was being watched the entire time. No one came out onto the dock. Eventually I sort of jogged back to my car, constantly looking around me, and I still constantly felt like I was being watched. I never returned to that trail alone. It still gives me the creeps just writing about it. Yikes. This is not my story, but that of my sister's. She's had a lot of weird experiences, but this one really struck me as scary. So my sister and her fiancé decided to do a little vacation type thing and rented a trailer out in the middle of nowhere. Sometime during their time there, this was around 1 or 2 a.m. They got into a bad fight, and he stormed off to another part of the trailer, and my sister was left feeling frustrated. All of a sudden she felt eerily calm, and then she said she got an image in her head of this clearing with rocks, and despite never having been there, she felt drawn to it and seemed to know how to get there, like something wanted her to go there. So she put on her shoes, and her fiancé came out and asked her where she was going. She said she was going on a walk and then left. She told me she got about 50 feet from the trailer before she was hit with this extreme and heavy dread and fear, and she had a feeling that if she went any further, she would die. But she felt like she couldn't panic and run, so she tried her best to act calm. She calmly made her way back to the trailer, walked inside, and closed and locked the door behind her. Before her fiancé had a chance to ask what happened, they both heard something fast, way too fast, and a heavy run from the forest and towards the trailer. It ran all around and over the trailer before they heard it come up the steps to the door and stop. Her fiancé grabbed a knife and was going to confront whatever it was, but she begged him not to and told him there was nothing he could do to hurt it, so he didn't. They didn't get any sleep that night, and when daylight came, nothing was out there. The scariest thing, she said, was that they never heard it, whatever it was, leave. 2 weeks ago, deer season started up, and I decided to venture into the wilderness in an area I saw while doing a little electronic scouting. The area I wanted to get to is public land that is surrounded by private ranches, so I sleuthed around to get information on some of the big ranches. Eventually, I contacted a rancher and got permission to travel across their land to the mountains and forests. Of course, there were conditions. They said I must only hike or ride a bicycle through their land, the first mile of my adventure, and I could not start any fires on their land. Very reasonable conditions for free passage and hunting permission. So with permissions attained, I prepped the gear for my trip, my mountain bike, straps to hold down my pack itself with my hunting and survival gear, including water and food, my clothes, and my rifle for the day, a Mauser 98K. I chose this because the design is very streamlined with no straps or charging handles to snag, and the bolt can lock to prevent snagging and accidentally opening it while riding with it on my back. With my gear ready to go, I was up at 4:30 a.m. and out at the gates of the ranch at 5:30. It had rained the night before, so any tracks I saw would be new, and my movement would be muffled. It was a great hunting day in the making. I saddled up my bicycle and rolled onto the dirt road. Before I go on with the meat and potatoes, I will say that I am not a novice outdoorsman. I've put many hundreds of miles under my heels in swamps, deserts, snowy mountains, and open fields. Also, though I dislike it, I have done plenty of trips alone, and I am no stranger to the ill effects of fatigue. I have never experienced anything akin to the situation. I say this beforehand because I am sure these questions and doubts will arrive in your mind later. The first mile I rode on a well-traveled dirt road, passing through open pasture with plenty of grazing cattle on the hillsides and upon the plains, going gently at an incline to the foothills at the base of the mountains. Once in the foothills, there was a fork in the road. One path was going steeply off to the right and on top of a hill, which evolved into a ridgeline, and the other path was gently inclined to the left and into a tight slot canyon. My intuition told me to go left since the canyon floor had probably been leveled by years of water travel and floods, making it a smooth and simple ride. Boy, was I wrong? The canyon was overgrown in many places with groves of aspens and rabbit brush. Sometimes the aspens were so thick in the tight confines of the canyon that they blocked the sky. In the tight turns of the canyon, sediments piled up into small but very steep, muddy hills. In two spots, the canyon opened up into larger clearings, about 1.5 acres in size. It was in these spots that I found a few cattle resting and grazing. My approach was so silent that I rode right up on the cows without their noticing, and they broke into a panic for a few seconds before realizing I was no threat. It was at the end of the second clearing or open area that I came to a spot I would call the Straits. Massive cliffs from both sides of the canyon lowered, then converged to a bottleneck that was only about 20 feet wide. As I approached the Straits, I was impressed by the geological formation and took a picture a ways off. When I got to the mouth of the Straits, I had my first moment of distress, let's call it. It was almost as if I had crossed a threshold of some kind. When I went one step through the Straits, a massive, sudden gust of wind blew, knocking me off balance. At the time, I was surprised and taken back. For a moment, I felt like someone was slamming a door in my face, as if it were done intentionally to make me feel unwelcome. After the surprise faded, I thought that a gust from a mountainside pressure system must have blown through the canyon and been amplified by the sudden bottleneck where I stood. Just coincidental timing. The original thought faded entirely, and I didn't even reflect on it till the next day. I was out deer hunting, and that was on my mind. As I went through the final stretch of the slot canyon, the sky darkened, and the wind increased, blowing into my face. Again, just a storm rolling in, which I was ready for and welcomed. I was downwind, so the deer would never smell me coming. I hit the end of the trail at a third, very large opening and pasture where 6 cows were grazing. To my right was a large uphill canyon cutting off to the south from the east to west slot canyon I had been riding in. There, I planned to ditch my bike and hike up the steep ridges and mountainside on foot, looking into the canyon below for deer while also scanning the slopes. This area of the forest and mountains was far from any sign of roads or humans, other than the horse trail cutting through the canyon I had rode in through, obviously used by cowpokes to herd the cattle in and out. I hid my bike and took off on foot. In the next several hours, I did my hunting and scouting. I saw plenty of tracks and fresh scat. I even followed the tracks to a sleeping spot and a perfect kill zone. But by the time I found this spot, the day had grown late, and I had put in some 3 miles of intense biking and another 3 of extremely arduous hiking on nearly vertical slopes with my gear. Also, frost had come in a few hours before and was freezing the moisture of my breath onto my beard and mustache, and I did not want to risk getting stuck in a storm. Besides, no deer were out in that weather, and there was no way I'd be packing a carcass out in my exhausted state. I sat on a ridge, ate some food, and stood up to leave. As I did, I slipped into the loose rocks atop the canyon wall and almost went head over heels to my demise. Luckily, I righted myself, fell onto the slope, and used the rocks to break my fall. I looked down to check my footing and saw a familiar shape between the weathered rocks, a straight-walled cartridge casing. I picked it up and pocketed it. Most straight-walled cartridges fell out of use by the early 1900s, so I knew it was an Antu. When I got home and cleaned it up, I saw it to be a 38 to 55 manufactured in the 1880s or 90s, it would seem. After the discovery, I began my trip back to the bike. About halfway back to my bike I began to get a creeping suspicion that I was being watched. I had no reason to feel that way. I heard no noises or saw anything alarming, but a feeling of paranoia began to invade my mind in a subtle way. It was so subtle, I had hardly noticed. When I reached my bike, I felt distress at the fact that I had to resituate my pack and strap it down before I could ride. I questioned myself and literally paused and mentally asked myself, why are you such an uppest man? Trying to make sense of my irritation. My answer to myself was surprising, because you're being followed. Panic shot through me like electricity. Before I knew what I was doing, I instinctively snatched my rifle from the tree I was leaning against, flicked off safety, and scanned all 360 degrees around me. Nothing was there at all, but I couldn't shake the feeling. In fact, the feeling evolved, and I began to feel dread. I don't know if any of you readers are familiar with the sensation of dread, so I will describe how it feels to you. It is not like the snap of panic. When panic ensues, we feel a threat, but our minds are still clouded, and we act on instinct. It's not like fear, which I would say is a crescendo of anxiety, suspension, and suspicion of an illness. Dread is a cold, suffocating, fully cognizant recognition that something terrible or evil has undoubtedly found you and is preparing to take you. I didn't know what this something was, but I decided to throw my gear on my back, get out of the trees at the mouth of the canyon, and awkwardly ride out to the clearing and set by the cows. If something was hunting me, maybe the cows would see it first while I was saddling up, giving me a warning, or maybe one of them would get pounced on instead of me. As I got close to the cows, they backed up a little bit, but I stayed nearby and watched as I strapped my pack down. I looked up to scan and see where the cows were looking. Some looked at me, some looked to the canyon I left, and a calf was munching grass, paying no mind at all. In a few minutes, I was packed and checked my map to see if there was an alternative route out. My instincts told me that going back the way I came would not be a good choice. Sure enough, the path I had chosen earlier in the day, the fork to the right, led over and around to the same clearing I was in. This new path was longer, though, and I would have to climb to the summit of a steep and large hill first. On the positive side, from the peak down, it would be all downhill, and I could speedily cruise the hell away from whatever the something was. I jumped on the bike and headed to the base of the trail. As I drew nearer, I saw I had to pass into another thick, mile-long aspen forest before reaching the bald peak. I didn't like that at all, but my mind told me it was the best option. The hill was steep and muddy. The air was freezing and dry, but the ground was wet. My muscles were burning like hell as I pushed my bike up the slope and slipped in the mud. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, literally. After only a few minutes, my lungs and tail off at a distance in case they get pounced. Reflecting now, I think it's ironic they were doing that, given that I was using them as bait only a bit earlier. As I mused at the possibility, I turned to continue walking and saw something in the woods to my left that confirmed my suspicion. There was the skeleton of a cow, well over a year old, about 30 yards into the aspens. With that, I wheeled my rifle from my back to my chest, moved it from full safety to half safety, and kept chugging up the hill. I paused several more times for breath, and every time I turned, the cows were there, frozen, staring at me, following me up the hill. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the peak. As I cleared the forest, I saw other cows on the bald peak, grazing bunch grass. I paused to breathe, and the cows who had been following me passed me up and joined their companions. At that point, I felt relief and was safe again, and I cruised my bike down the hill all the way down to the ranch and back to my car. It was 5 p.m. I put my bike in the back and went home. I got home, caught up with the wife and kids, ate dinner, and went to sleep with little mention of what happened. That night, I had a nightmare. The feeling of dread returned, and a voice in my head appeared, telling me to never go back there again. The voice sounded like mine but felt like someone else. The message was clear, though, only terrible things would await me if I returned there. Not wanting to test this, I accepted whatever this something was telling me, and in my dream, I told it with my own separate voice that I wasn't going to go back. In the time since all this occurred, I have reviewed that day in my mind as well as the pictures that I took during the first half of the day. I realize now that the creeping sensation of paranoia has been making its way into my mind since the moment that I entered the canyon to the left. My mind was still so focused and excited about getting out to hunt that I didn't recognize my state until later. When I look at some of the photos of the forest that I took, it makes me uncomfortable. After a couple of days had passed, I told my wife the extent of what happened, and I explained to her that I wasn't going to go back to that spot, despite having found good signs for wildlife and hunting. It was during this discussion with her that I realized that the overall sensation that I had was new to me. Part of me felt fear from potential physical harm, nothing new, but the dread that came upon me that day and that night was from something spiritually evil. I've been in bear territory in my life, I've been in wolf territory and bobcat territory. As I said before, I've had plenty of adventures in my free time where I've been alone and in the butt crack of nowhere. I've been tired, fatigued, hungry, and cold. I've heard things move in the forest when I was on my own and was briefly spooked by things. In the 2 weeks since this happened, I've been out half a dozen other times on my own hunting in very similar situations, but I felt absolutely nothing like I did that day. Something was following me, something was trying to get me, something unnatural. I don't know how any of the other stuff that I saw that day ties in, like the cowboy cartridge, the cow carcass, or the staring cows. I don't know if they even tie in at all. This could all just be the weird case of mania that I came down with. But what I do know is that I'm going to keep my promise that I made to that something, and I'm not going to go back, or at least not anytime soon.